This is Disco Elysium. Released on PC in 2019, it's a CRPG similar to that of Baldur's Gate or Planescape Torment, where you play as Harry Dubois, a detective who has awoken from a night of consuming enough illicit substances that he's completely lost his memory, to the point where he can't remember his past or even his name. The first moments of the game are spent in a grimy hotel room. Harry's clothes are strewn across it, the window is broken, the bathroom door has been torn off its hinges, and although we don't know how all this has happened, in time it's revealed that this mess is his doing. This scenario wasn't the result of a night of rockstar-inspired excess and debauchery, nor is it comical. It's bleak, upsetting, and the only company he has is his limbic system and his ancient reptilian brain. He asks his limbic system what's waiting for him when he wakes up, before he's reborn as a blank slate, and it offers him this absurd vision of evil apes on a giant ball fighting and dying over resources, and that if he doesn't beat the other apes, then he'll lose. All Harry can do is comment on how sad this reality is, and his limbic system reveals to him that he drowned in this sadness long ago, that he lost. You, as the player, interact with the world around Harry through simple mouse clicks, talking with people he's met once before, not knowing whether the chaos of his existence has affected them in some way. You're given choices where you can learn more about him and what he's done, and in some cases you're given the opportunity to apologize or shun responsibility entirely. Harry forms an alliance with his interim partner, Detective Kim Kitsuragi, as they collaborate to unravel the intricate circumstances surrounding the murder of a mercenary in Martinez, who, along with his allies, was dispatched to violently disrupt the dock workers' strike. This city languishes in a state of desolation, marred by the aftermath of a failed communist uprising and the indiscriminate bombardment inflicted by warship artillery. The streets lie in disrepair, buildings bear the scars of conflict, and the inhabitants' morale has been deeply eroded. On a mechanical level, Disco Elysium is simple. You point your cursor over objects or people, click on them, and then you're often given lengthy amounts of dialogue from a narrator or the NPC, followed by responses that Harry can give, or choosing certain actions. There isn't any combat in the game or other elements that require some form of complicated or well-timed input from the player. The closest that you get to that is choosing the direction that Harry walks in by clicking on the floor. There are moments that resemble combat, like when you get the option of delivering a flying roundhouse kick to a eugenics-obsessed weirdo, but that's just one of the many choices that you have. Disco Elysium expects you to navigate the world and its problems with Harry's ability to talk with people and extrapolate information through his various means. His success at doing so is determined through how you invest in his skills, but unlike in many other games, when you allocate skill points in Disco Elysium, it doesn't grant Harry spells or improve his ability to land critical hits. Instead, it increases his chances of succeeding in dialogue choices or performing certain actions which relate to his intellect, psyche, physique, and motorics. It all seems very complicated and alien when first playing it, but you're ultimately making the choices that alter Harry's everyday abilities and unlocking parts of his memories that remained dormant after obliterating his memory. You can also alter these stats by changing the clothing that Harry wears, which is sort of this game's armor system, similar to what you'd find in other RPGs. It can result in Harry looking like he's being kicked through a thrift shop, but it's part of the game's charm, and it's thematically fitting given how Harry is basically a train wreck of a person. Your success at performing these actions is also determined by the game's dice roll system, where you're given the odds when picking a certain dialogue option or action. Your skills can increase your chances, but the possibility of failure always exists regardless. What makes it interesting though is that in most cases you're able to progress regardless of failure, but there's a good chance that it might not be a favorable outcome for everyone involved. You can still fail though. Harry can die in various ways, and rather uniquely, he can also experience ego death, where he simply gives up on everything due to the overwhelming despair or even embarrassment. Disco Elysium is a fascinating, brilliant game. Its world is rich with detail and history. The characters all feel properly actualized. Its story is enthralling. The message behind it is eternal, and although it can feel crushingly depressing at times, it still leaves just the right amount of space for levity and hope. Without a doubt, it's easily in my top 3 favorite games of all time. It's one of those experiences where as soon as I finished, I wished that I could wipe my memory of it just so I could play it through with fresh eyes. I finished the game 3 times since its release, and soon after I started recording the footage for this video, I decided I'm going to play through for a 4th time. Simply put, Disco Elysium is a masterpiece. However, as much as it pains me to say it, I wouldn't recommend it to everyone, for the simple fact that I know a lot of people would think that Disco Elysium is boring. And as much as I disagree with that, I fully understand why someone might think that way. For starters, as I mentioned earlier, most of the game is just dialogue. The script is over 1 million words long, which, for context, is longer than all of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings books and The Hobbit put together, and a lot of people don't like reading too much when they play a game. It's also not mechanically engaging, seeing as most of what you do involves pointing and clicking on elements on the screen, largely at your own pace. The quality of a game is often contingent on how well crafted its mechanical gameplay elements are and how satisfying it is for a player to interact with it. For example, with a game like the recently released Tekken 8, the feedback is simple. You push a button and your character reacts to that by performing an action such as a punch or a kick. You can develop your skills further by learning combos, pressing the right inputs at the right time to perform a string of attacks without interruption. Most games work on this premise, since most games are action-based, but Disco Elysium and other dialogue-heavy games such as visual novels are not only devoid of these mechanics, they're built from the ground up to intentionally avoid them. Some people love this, but many just see it as boring, even going so far as to say that they're not real games, they're just books, which to be honest is kind of insulting to both mediums. Disco Elysium may be one of the greatest games ever made, but it's not for everyone. However, I can't fault people for feeling that way, because many people who play video games have been conditioned over the years to believe that if you're going to create a game, then the number one priority is that it needs to be fun on a mechanical level. It needs to feel good to play. A game can be bleak and depressing in tone, but it needs to reward the player for their choice of inputs and reaction times. Something like The Last of Us Part 2 is celebrated for its story, but for those who aren't too invested in it, it can still be considered a good game by those who play it specifically for its gameplay elements, even if that gameplay involves killing dogs and people in unsettlingly realistic ways. I've just got to say though, developers, please don't make us kill dogs in video games. Killing dogs is like an instant 2 points knocked off the review score for me. Now, how a person engages with media, whether that's a video game, a movie, music, or anything else, is up to them. We all have our preferences for what we want out of the things that we consume. When someone wants to watch a movie, they may want action, whereas another person may find that boring and instead gains enjoyment from a smaller, character-driven film with complex themes. Someone may exclusively listen to pop music that's enjoyed by millions across the world, whereas another may only like avant-garde jazz. It's all just personal preference based on what speaks to us the most. These other forms of media, however, aren't subject to the same expectation that some have with video games. A song can be what the artist wants it to be, a film can be the vision of a director, and a novel can be the words of one person. Yes, there are some forms of intervention or assistance in these, like a studio making suggestions what to include in a movie based on focus group feedback, or an editor cleaning up a certain story element in a novel, but they're still largely not subject to the mandate of their audience. Video games, however, are subject to the mandate of being fun, and this demand can impose limitations on what our games can potentially be. Many people expect their games to be fun on a mechanical level, and if they're not, they're either bad or not a real game. If we consider games as an artistic medium, imposing the requirement of fun can create restrictions, and has already fostered the mindset in many players that there's no fun to be extracted from a game, then everything else that it brings to the table is irrelevant. Each of us has different interpretations of fun, kind of like our taste in music, but some music naturally has a broader appeal thanks to its familiarity and prevalence in the music industry. Allow me to demonstrate. Now, I'm not a musicologist, and since I'm a guitarist, I can barely read music. Other guitarists will know what I mean by that. Regardless of that though, music and its construction has some universal truths, and that is that there is a structure to the progression of notes that makes sense in our heads, and it has an innate appeal to it. Whether that's a product of our evolution or due to how music has progressed over the centuries is hard to say, but the fact is that there are some things that work and some things that don't. Take for example, the A major scale. There is an order to it that simply makes sense to you. Each of these notes belongs to the key of A, and those notes between those intervals don't belong. If you include extra notes, then it loses its appeal and starts to feel dissonant, almost uncomfortable. This structure applies to chords too. Take for example the 1-4-5-1 chord progression, arguably the most famous and widely used progressions in all music throughout a variety of genres. In the order of natural note intervals, here's what it looks like, and for an example, here's what it sounds like when you play it. It's instantly recognizable, and I 100% guarantee that at some point in your life you will have heard a song using some form of it, such as Brown Eyed Girl by Van Morrison, Good Riddance by Green Day, Ring of Fire by Johnny Cash, and many, many, many more. It speaks to us, and it's easy to identify even if you don't know a thing about music. Once again though, if you break away from traditional chord progressions and do something like play random jazz chords, it sounds like this. Now, to many of you, that may have sounded god-awful. What I played there was completely random, I didn't choose any particular notes, and I just went around the fretboard using whatever jazz chord I knew, but regardless of my intention, there's a good chance that it appealed to some of you. It spoke to you, despite it sounding like chaos to everyone else. It's inexplicable, but it worked. That's kind of how fun works. Like music, your version of fun may be different to another person's. What one person may find boring, complicated, or confusing may be enthralling to another, and even games made with the intention of being fun first and foremost may be painfully boring to some people. And while we're on the subject of music, check out my new album, Rhythm and Blues. 6 hours of singing about how crappy YouTube is while pretending I know how to play guitar. Anthony Fantano called it the most egotistical yet somehow most self-deprecating album I've ever heard. And as YouTuber turned singer-songwriters go, this is a new low. Available on a 14-tape set. Personal check only. So, back to games. Let's talk about the 2012 game Spec Ops: The Line, a game that had something to say, that games about war and their popularity are a problem. Over the years, Spec Ops has become beloved for its story, and how its impact is successful largely due to it being a video game, where you, as a participant, have to take responsibility for how things play out. It's a military shooter, of which there were a dime a dozen back in the early 2010s, but Spec Ops: The Line wears this fact proudly, and for good reason. During this era, military shooter games were a celebration of the heroism of the armed forces. They placed you in the shoes of elite soldiers, fighting against numerous threats and often insurmountable odds. You didn't have any special powers other than an ability to heal from bullet wounds quickly enough that it would make Wolverine envious. You were just a well-trained soldier who's been tasked with defending their country and the people that they love. Why you're doing this and what sort of relationship your enemy has with your nation is usually left unexplored. As far as you're concerned, you're doing the right thing. Without getting too deep into the story, Spec Ops: The Line turns this narrative on its head. You're an American soldier who's been sent into Dubai with a small squad to deal with a rogue American battalion led by Lieutenant Colonel John Conrad. As you progress through the game, it becomes apparent that things aren't quite what they seem. Your character, Captain John Walker, continues with his mission and along the way is faced with various choices. Regardless of your choices though, and the truths that you learn, Walker plays the good soldier and continues with his mission, leading him to commit numerous atrocities, believing that he's doing the right thing, all rationalized as the cost for fighting for the greater good. These themes exist throughout this story, and the intention is to make players consider how war and conflict is celebrated without question in video games. No matter the choices that you make, the outcome of this story is bleak. Even if you choose to avoid killing certain people, because regardless of these few choreographed choices, if you want to see the game through to its end, you still need to kill people. The game judges you for continuing to play it, asking why you should care about your action, highlights how killing is used for entertainment purposes, and asks you directly if you feel like a hero yet. With all this in mind, the message behind Spec Ops: The Line is that if you don't want to be complicit with the video games industry's celebration of war, then your only choice is to not play their game. That if you don't want to be like Captain Walker, then you shouldn't play as Captain Walker. Put the game down. Spec Ops may have eventually earned the recognition it deserved, but around the time it was released, it was largely shunned by gamers and reviewers. It was dismissed as being a mechanically shallow experience that didn't do much to differentiate itself from its supposed peers. It was a military shooter, but it was seen as just another military shooter, because a lot of people refused to see it beyond how it felt to play. It is true that Spec Ops is fairly unimpressive when it comes to gameplay. The combat is pretty standard and it doesn't really try to do anything new. There is some debate as to whether this mundanity was the developer's intent, as yet another way of highlighting how stale the genre had become, and although I do like that theory, it might be a bit of a reach. Now, as someone who does hold Spec Ops: The Line in high regard, I can say for sure it wasn't fun to play. And I go as far as to say that it aggressively refused to let players have fun, but it had its reasons for doing so, and they were good ones. It delivered its message in a powerful and effective way, and although it could have potentially done so while also being a fun game, if it did that, then it would have undercut what it was trying to say. That when war is celebrated through games, whether that's through story or gameplay, it turns a blind eye to the horrible truths found in real-life conflict. There are also some games that can become fun, dependent on your level of investment and skill, by which I mean difficult games. Many games offer difficulty options, and that's great, but there are some that are designed from the ground up to be hard and require a substantial time investment to get better at. Prior to your skill improving though, a higher difficulty level can be off-putting to a lot of players. Many players simply want to pick up a game and feel competent from the very beginning, even with limited tools. But harder games onboard players by telling you what it expects from you, by essentially saying that this is how the game is, and if you want to progress, you need to learn how to play. Now, since this is YouTube and I'm talking about video games right now, you're probably assuming that this is the point where I'll start talking about the brilliance of Souls-like games, but I'm going to go off script here and give up on that sweet SEO by talking about something significantly less popular. Recently, I've been playing the game Sifu, a fantastic kung fu action game where you, as the nameless protagonist, charge through 5 levels by fighting a variety of foes, from basic grunts to more challenging enemies and bosses. The combat is fast, fluid, expertly choreographed, and rewarding when you're good at it. Sifu has an interesting mechanic though, where if you die, you don't respawn at the last checkpoint, you revive on the spot, but each time you do, your character ages, with you starting at age 20 and maxing out at age 70. If you die at that point, it's game over. Your age has an impact on gameplay though. When you're young, you have more health but do less damage, but as you get older, you get less health and do more damage, offering less room for mistakes but rewarding aggressive play. It's a controversial system which arguably punishes failure too harshly, but much like learning a martial art, the game expects you to keep trying. It wants you to learn its tight parry windows for each enemy, when to dodge and which direction to choose, how to manage large groups of enemies, efficient ways of dealing with tougher opponents, using the right moves for the right situation, and how to be consistent. When I first played Sifu though, I was really bad at it. Really bad. Bad enough that I stopped having fun. I really enjoyed the combat though. It felt amazing to play, and it's the closest that you can get to being able to play a classic kung fu movie. I was bad enough that I put it down and told myself that even though it felt like it was made for someone like me, it regrettably wasn't for me. However, one day when I was looking for something to play and I was pretty bored, I decided to install Sifu again and gave it another try. I was still bad at it, but I wanted to play it, so I kept going and going and going, getting punched, kicked, and thrown hard enough to make me eligible for a free bus pass. Once again, I wasn't having fun. Until I did. I can't claim to be a master at Sifu, but I can finish a fight with considerably less bruises, and walk away young enough that I can't legally buy a drink to help dull the pain. I'm good enough that I can comfortably enter a flow state in which I can maintain focus on a fight and not get flustered, where my fighter feels like an extension of me and I can carefully and considerately input actions on the controller, avoiding mashing the buttons in hope that it's just enough to win by some fluke. It just clicked one day, and Sifu went from being a frustrating rejection of my abilities to something that I love returning to. For every person like me that persevered through Sifu's expectations, there are hundreds who put down the controller because it didn't immediately appeal to their definition of fun. There are those who stopped or never played due to personal limitations, something which I believe is worth catering to regardless of how hard a game may be. After all, we all should be able to enjoy games in ways that we want, but for those of us fortunate enough to be able to play with fewer limitations, the time and attention required from games like Sifu, Souls-like, or any other title with a considerable difficulty curve hides its fun behind the caveat of devotion. The level of that devotion varies, but you can usually glean how much a game demands from you by looking at the percentage of people who have earned achievements or trophies for completing a game, and for tough games, it's fairly low. There is one game genre that has a complicated relationship between fun and difficulty, and it's one that I love, despite, in my estimation, not being very good at. Fighting games. Not like Sifu, but one-on-one fighting games such as Street Fighter 6, Tekken 8, Guilty Gear Strive, Mortal Kombat, and many more. I've been playing fighting games since I was a kid, both on consoles and in the arcade. I would study moves lists for hours, pump all my weekly allowance into arcade cabinets to beat the unreasonably difficult arcade modes, and play against whoever was up for a round. I wanted to be good at them because I found them fun. It's a genre that just speaks to me with their eclectic character rosters and energetic short bursts of gameplay. There's an interesting contradiction with fighting games though. The average person can pick up a fighting game with no prior knowledge of how to play and probably have fun. They can move around using the directions, and every button that you press will perform various attacks. When playing against the CPU in arcade mode, that's usually enough to win until you get to the later enemies. But depending on the human you play against, the fun factor can change drastically. When game consoles became the primary home for fighting games, online play became the way to play. Before this, whenever I played against someone like a friend, it wouldn't even be a close match, and I'm not bragging there. I'd win because I had the advantage of studying in advance, whereas the friend was just pressing buttons and hoping for the best. And to be clear, I was the only one of my friends that played fighting games, so that's why it was like that. I was a lonely boy. Still am. When I started playing online against strangers though, I learned a very painful truth. I was nowhere near as good as I thought I was. I'd go as far as to say that I was terrible, and all of a sudden, these games didn't feel so fun to me anymore. To this day, I still love fighting games. I play them regularly and I enjoy the various modes available. I also play online against others, something which brings some anxiety, but I can't think of another game genre that offers such a brutal reality check, that shatters the Dunning-Kruger effect so efficiently. Fighting games are deceptively hard to learn though. In games like Tekken, your average person can pick Eddie Gordo and win by mashing some buttons, but beneath that simple level of play there are numerous complexities, and getting to know these and how to apply them is key to being good at video games. There are hundreds of different terminologies and concepts across the fighting game genre that most people who play these games will have never heard of. A few examples include frame advantage, frame trap, mix-up, okizime, cancels, meaty, neutrals, counter, punish, wake up, zoning, hit confirm. The list goes on, long enough that there's sites with glossaries that cover all of these games. Fighting games are complicated, and the people who are good at them are truly skilled. Depending on who or what you're playing against though, there are diminishing returns on the fun that you can have with the genre. The fact is though, that of all of the genres in the world of video games, fighting games are probably the most deceptive in their simplicity. On the surface, it's two characters on a screen, and when you push buttons, they hit each other. Simple, right? You can load up Street Fighter 6, pick Cammy, jump around and keep pushing buttons that seem to be working. On the other hand, you can spend hours labbing in training mode, discovering combo strings and learning how to execute them flawlessly each time. So instead of doing something like repeatedly jump kicking your enemy, you could do something like, I don't know, crouching light punch into standing back medium punch to a heavy kick launcher, forward jump medium punch to EX cannon strike, finishing with a choice between cannon spike, spin drive smasher, or delta red assault if you have level 3 super. Easy, right? Mercifully, fighting games are becoming much more accessible with modern control schemes, so that people who don't want to invest their time into learning special moves and complicated combo strings can perform otherwise difficult feats with simplified inputs. That is honestly great, because ultimately it allows people to have fun with a lesser investment and feel as though they're able to perform adequately in an otherwise prohibitive genre. Some might say that modern control schemes undermine the skill required to be good at fighting games, but I say, so what? The original, more technical inputs still exist in games like Street Fighter 6 and Tekken, and they allow for more flexibility in how you approach a fight, but modern control schemes allow those who just want to have fun to have fun. Fighting games don't have to be fun, but it's good that they can be. Not everyone has to strive to be Daigo, Sonic Fox, or Tokido. Around the early 2010s, as the indie game scene was gaining larger recognition, there was a genre of game that was growing in popularity dubbed walking simulators. One of the most famous ones being Gone Home. In this game, you played as a young woman, Katie. returning to her family home from overseas to find it almost empty. She finds a note on the front door from her younger sister Samantha, asking Katie to explore what remains in the house to discover what happened. The game involves looking around the house, reading journals and notes to gain an insight as to what happened, and use that information to figure out where to look next. There are some light puzzle and exploration elements to it, but mechanically the game is very simple, opting to tell a story first and foremost. It's a fairly short but very affecting tale in which you, as Katie, learns about the dissolution of her family, caused by her father's insecurity as a writer, her mother becoming distant from him, and her younger sister discovering that she has an attraction to women, which her parents object to. The reception to it by the gaming press was very positive, and many people who played it loved it too. However, the game received some vicious criticisms from certain contingents of gamers for being overly simplistic, with no real skill required to play it, and little to offer beyond its story. They also objected to it being celebrated by critics, believing that it was setting a bad precedent for how future games should be made. And although there were games released with a similar feel, such as Dear Esther and What Remains of Edith Finch, Gone Home's popularity ultimately didn't reshape the industry. It's also worth noting that this occurred during the Gamergate movement, where many objected to the inclusion of LGBTQ+ themes in Gone Home, but this was often thinly veiled by the claim of the game being boring or even accusations of it not being a real game, hence the backhanded term walking simulator. Once again though, we have to ask, is there a mandate for games to be fun? And the simple answer is no. I think one thing that we might need to consider is to start taking steps away from long-established naming conventions. Specifically, should we still call games games? I think we've reached a point where most of us have accepted that the medium of video games is capable of producing things that don't fit the definition of a game, wherein you attempt to achieve certain goals by using skills that you accumulate through play. Video games can be a vehicle in which you can simply tell a story that's enhanced through your active participation, something which mediums like film and books can't achieve. And that not only makes it unique, it gives it the flexibility to do something special. When you weigh it down with the need to be fun, you put limitations in place which may potentially prohibit them from delivering a more potent message that could otherwise be achieved by removing the mandates of fun. I don't know what else you could call video games without them sounding silly or pretentious, but if we're to allow the medium to be less narrowly defined, then we need to give up on the idea of them purely being games and explore what else they can be. After all, we've pretty much been doing this since the inception of video games. It's just that the saturation of fun-oriented games has skewed some people's expectations on what they can be. It also goes without saying, but you can tell deep and meaningful stories while also being fun. I just wanted to make that clear and not make it seem as though I'm saying that these experiences can only be delivered through games without mechanical complexities. We all have our different ideas of fun. We all have our different ideas of art, and the two things don't have to be exclusive or forced to coexist alongside each other just to achieve mass appeal. Some things speak to us, some things don't. It's fine if you prefer fun games, and it's fine if you don't. I know I'm fine with being an outlier with certain genres. The survival game genre is ludicrously popular right now, but every time I've tried to play one, I've just found them painfully boring. Minecraft has sold more copies than the Bible, and I find it really dull. I'm okay with grinding in a JRPG, but I'm not keen on farming for materials to build stuff and eat. I tried out Palworld recently since it's on Game Pass, and despite its immense popularity, I just couldn't get into it. Something about it didn't click with me, even outside of its pretty gross and blasé approach to enslavement and its non-union equivalent Pokemon knockoffs. Speaking of which, Pokemon. It's literally the highest grossing media franchise of all time with millions of highly devoted players, and even though I enjoyed it when I was a kid, as an adult, I just find it boring. And it doesn't help that in a game where evolution is one of the core concepts, the franchise ironically hasn't evolved all that much. A lot of fans are obviously fine with that, but I feel like I need more. That's just me though. Audience reception may be glowing for these games, but does it make me wrong for not liking them? Of course not. They're just not my version of fun. It's important to try different things and see if there's anything out there that might be for you. I mentioned how much I love Disco Elysium at the start of this video, and if I'm fully honest, I didn't think that I would be interested in it at first. I eventually gave it a try, and I found that not only did I love it, I loved it enough for it to be considered one of my all-time greats. It is okay to have fun with a video game, but it's also okay to reject fun. A world in which we demand our media fulfill certain criteria would ultimately result in bland, homogeneous products. Besides, in this day and age, we've seen what we can get when you ask developers to make games that attempt to mainline a constant flow of endless fun. We get Suicide Squad kills the Justice League, Marvel's Avengers, and Anthem, live service games designed to keep you hooked with repetitive fun loops without offering much in the way of substance beyond trying to make bigger numbers appear on screen. And I don't know about you, but I'm not comfortable with a future like that, especially when it means that great single-player game studios like Rocksteady and BioWare have to do things like this just to make sure that they're bringing enough money for their publisher. So with all that in mind, I think we ultimately have to consider letting go of some baggage, letting go of expectations, because if you want to travel far, then that means that you have to drop some weight. You have to jettison any of that baggage that is holding you back. And that means getting rid of the mandate of having fun. And when that happens, we can truly see how far this medium can go. Hi there. Before I get started, I just wanted to really quickly say, if you want to support this channel, you can do so at patreon.com/Salari. Any amount that you can offer goes a very long way, and it helps produce these videos and pay my rent, life stuff. But anyway, here's the video you came here for. Enjoy. I recently stumbled across an article about the upcoming game Stellar Blade, an action game produced by South Korean developer Shift Up, where the game director Hyung-tae Kim was discussing the design of its protagonist, Eve. The design of Eve isn't necessarily controversial or even new compared to what we've seen in the past. She's a lithe woman with a conventionally attractive face, long gorgeous hair, and by default wears a skin-tight bodysuit, which accentuates parts of her anatomy. As character designs go, it's quite good. Not really iconic, but distinct enough that it stands out. But as the industry has started to gravitate towards female character designs that avoid overtly sexualizing them, it's interesting to see one in this day and age which leans into it quite heavily. For the sake of clarity, sexualized character designs, regardless of gender, aren't inherently a bad thing. What matters is context. Are they sexualized because it says something about their character and how they want to express themselves? Are they dressed this way because it's for the sake of the audience, or perhaps a mixture of both? Intent is important. In this article though, when the director of Stellar Blade was asked about the design of Eve, he made the context clear, saying, "When it comes to the design, we put special attention on the back of the character, because the player is always facing the back of the character when they're playing. That's what they see the most of. So we thought this was pretty important." In the case of Eve, it's fairly clear emphasis is on her backside, which is accentuated by her impossibly vacuum-packed outfit. Eve's movements are fluid and elegant, yet powerful. It's similar to what you'd see in other female-led action games such as Bayonetta or Nier Automata, two other titles which have both been scrutinized and celebrated for their character designs, and both of which have context behind their designs. At the time of publishing this video, Stellar Blade hasn't been released yet, so no one has any knowledge of whether the design of Eve has some form of context which validates it, but based on the interview with the director, right now it seems apparent that she's being created with the intent to titillate, to have something nice to look at while you navigate the world, and given Shift Up's history with game development and character designs such as the mobile game Goddess of Victory Nikke, where its female cast have meticulously crafted butt jiggle physics, it's safe to say that there might be nothing beyond that. Maybe there is, and I'm not privy to the details, but as Freud once said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, and in this case, the cigar is jiggling buttocks. It's not necessarily a tragedy, in many ways it's kind of ridiculous, but it made me wonder, is there something more to this? Is there something going on in South Korea's game industry or even their society as a whole? Is it a predominantly male-led industry looking to fulfill their desire to stare at perfectly crafted ideals of the female form for hours on end, or does it speak to how women are seen in the country? Well, as I did some research on the matter, it turned out that it was kind of both, but it ran much, much deeper than that. That there's a perilous landscape that women in South Korea need to navigate in education, the workplace, and their everyday life. How many of them are treated as though they must be seen and not heard, and when they are heard, their voices are stifled or curated through politicians or senior management that refuses to protect women when they're vulnerable. We're at a point in history where South Korea has more cultural exports than it's ever had before, and they're being celebrated around the world for their films, music, TV shows, and indeed their games. But whilst this is happening, there's a dark undercurrent that's omnipresent throughout South Korea, which seeks to keep women from achieving equality with men by upholding long-standing cultural norms which relegate them to being second-class citizens. Eve may not be the cause of this, but she might be a symptom. Now, to lay some groundwork, I am not saying that the design of Eve or any video game character will result in the destruction of all progress made when it comes to the representation of women in media, and I'm not saying that there's no place for character designs like hers. It's a misconception to assume that individuals advocating for women's rights and better representation automatically reject sexualized characters. While some may hold that perspective, many others remain indifferent or even appreciate such designs. The reality is far from the simplistic black and white dichotomy often portrayed on the internet. Throughout my research into South Korean gaming culture though, I have learned that there is an extremely vocal and considerably large group of almost entirely male consumers who are rabidly opposed to the idea of video games, or any other form of media for that matter, being tampered with in ways that make it so they don't cater to them first and foremost. And this includes having characters that appeal to their ideal of female beauty. Over the past few years, the South Korean game industry has exploded in size and popularity. The country's esports scene was booming long before it became popular elsewhere in the world, and is home to some of the best players in the world, to the point where professional gamers for games like League of Legends are treated like bona fide national celebrities with an income to match. With such rapid growth comes a desire to appeal to consumers in cost-effective ways. What those desires can be varies. It can be as simple as making quality of life changes to gameplay systems or rebalancing certain mechanics, but it can also involve companies trying to placate the anger of their customers for reasons that extend far beyond the game they're playing, going so far as to encroach upon the private lives of the people who make them, to ensure that they have control over what they do and don't want to potentially see in the products they consume. In 2016, the voice actress Jae-young Kim, who worked on the MMO Closers, was fired by Nexon after gamers discovered that she posted a tweet which included a picture of her wearing a t-shirt with the words "Girls do not need a prince" on it. After numerous customers complained about this, claiming that she was a misandrist, Nexon immediately dismissed Jae-young Kim and replaced her voice in the game with another actor. As messaging goes, it's fair to say that it wasn't particularly brazen. It's the kind of thing that you might see on a mannequin in Target during Women's History Month, but nevertheless, to her employer and the male gamers they capitulated to, it was a bridge too far. Unfortunately for Jaeon, the t-shirt did have some baggage attached to it though, which she claims that she wasn't aware of when she purchased it. It was discovered that it was being sold by a South Korean feminist group called Magalia. Magalia was originally established with the intention of combating rampant misogyny found in online spaces by mirroring the tactics that men would use to complain about women and reversing the gender roles, with the overall aim of creating a humorous counterpoint or provoking outrage. As they grew, they became more involved in other causes to protect women online and in public spaces, such as taking down adult video sites where content featuring women was posted without their consent, and they advocated the Break the Corset movement, which was established with the intention of protesting South Korea's long-standing and unreasonably high beauty standards expected of women. More on that later. Magalia eventually gained a reputation for being an organization of men-hating radical feminists whose intention was to undermine and replace men through humiliation and discrimination. Magalia's activism did have some genuinely impactful results, and they frequently helped raise money for single mothers who are often stigmatized in South Korean society, and although at first they were celebrated by many, their tactics to fight misogyny became questionable, and even dangerous, to the point where their membership began to drop and were criticized harshly by some that remained. Magalia would go as far as to encourage women who were pregnant with males to get abortions, and even allegedly outed closeted gay men to their wives. And it's worth saying that not only is when and how a person discloses their sexuality to others a very delicate matter, in South Korea there's still a substantial amount of discrimination towards LGBTQ+ individuals. Regardless of the original intention behind Magalia, actions such as these are not acceptable. It's understandable that anger can fester within oppressed groups and reach a point where their sentiments may result in them being further ostracized, but the actions of Magalia ultimately became their undoing. Its more radical members began to do things such as posting real-life gory photographs of men and sharing their desire to commit illegal and explicit acts, which I can't repeat here due to YouTube's policy, but I don't think you'd want to hear it anyway. At the point in time in which Jaeyoung Kim posted the picture of her wearing Magalia's Girls Do Not Need a Prince t-shirt, the organization had already marred its reputation with its actions. Jaeyoung stated that she wasn't a member of Magalia's community and wasn't aware of the kind of things that they had done. She believed that they were a regular organization whose intent was to help women achieve equal rights, and she bought the t-shirt without any intention of instigating misandry. Ultimately though, Jaeyoung lost her job because people didn't like the idea of her having an association with a group that Korean men had a substantial amount of animosity towards. They didn't like thinking about a woman working in an industry they revere and the slim possibility of her influencing any changes that don't cater to men. This situation may seem outrageous, but it doesn't exist in a vacuum. For example, there was another incident in which a female concept artist who worked for IMC Games retweeted a post with the term "hanam" in it, which is Korean slang for disgusting men, which angered gamers to the point where they scoured the entirety of her social media profiles for more potential evidence of misandry, whether this was tweets, likes, accounts that she follows, or ones that follow her. When her employer addressed this, unlike Jaeyoung Kim, she wasn't fired, but she had to undergo what could generously be described as an inquisition, and had to agree to be interviewed by the company's CEO, Kim Hak-yu, where she was asked questions like why did you tweet the word "hanam" and why she liked certain posts. By the end of the interview, he concluded on her behalf that she didn't understand the difference between feminist groups such as Magalia and feminism in its original definition, and that she was mistaken in retweeting a tweet with the term "hanam." In reference to the investigation into his employee, he described it as "sa-sangum-jung," a method of verifying a person's beliefs and a term used during the Korean War to discern whether a citizen is a communist. It's an unsettlingly common practice for male gamers in South Korea to police and frequently comb through the backgrounds of women who work in the games industry and in other professions, including K-pop idols. They and their employers do so with the intention of ensuring they're capable of producing works that cater to men. And within the world of video gaming, if women in the industry fail the litmus test, male consumers will try and often succeed in getting them fired from positions that men deem valuable enough that they could push their own agenda, which they suspect is to diminish the worth of men in society, a sentiment which has been spreading rapidly among young South Korean men. Sexism towards women in South Korea expands far beyond the world of video games though. Within a very short space of time, the country went from being agriculture-based, but after pivoting to a focus on exporting domestically produced technologies, they experienced an explosion in economic growth, and to this day they allocate around 5% of their GDP on research and development. Thanks to their investments, South Korea has become home to some of the biggest and most popular technology companies in the world, including Samsung and LG, and car manufacturers like Hyundai and Kia. With economic growth came cultural changes and opportunities. Women were given more options for how they wished to live, and the long-standing expectation of them being wives and homemakers began to erode. This resulted in women being able to grow in education and work on building a career with less pressure on them to create a family early in life as possible, to the point where there's now less of a stigma towards women who choose to remain single. Despite being afforded more freedoms, South Korea's traditions and its treatment of women, which were heavily influenced by Japanese colonialism and the response to it, still put them in a place where they're often seen and treated like second-class citizens, where although they managed to establish a greater presence in work and schools, there are expectations for them to conform to certain gender roles. Women in South Korea might have gotten a foot in the door, but as soon as they walk in, the men in charge are quick to remind them of their gender. A young Korean woman who goes by the pseudonym Yuna shared her experiences in the workplace. On her first day of work as a bank clerk, she was surprised to have been given tasks by her boss that you wouldn't expect to find in the job description. She was first asked to make lunch for her entire team, and later in the day she was tasked to take home the hand towels from the men's bathroom and wash them in her free time. She refused at first and asked why the men who worked there couldn't clean the towels themselves, to which her boss replied, "How can you expect men to wash towels?" Believing that if she didn't comply, her job and potential career would be at risk, so she begrudgingly did as she was told. Obviously, this kind of treatment is demeaning. Yuna took this job with the expectation of doing what bank clerks do, but instead was given tasks where she was made to serve men to ensure that they could perform their jobs without having to look after themselves. What made matters worse though was that when she spoke to her female colleagues, she couldn't find the support that she was looking for. Instead, they told her, "It's like this everywhere, don't make a fuss." Up until last year, South Korea had one of the strictest parental leave policies in the world, which mandated 45 paid days off after childbirth, with a maximum of 90 days. Employers were, and still are, hesitant to hire women due to concerns about potential pregnancy-related absences, leaving women to choose between starting a family or pursuing a career. This policy exacerbated South Korea's already low birth rate, ranking among the worst in the world. And in 2020, the country reached the population death cross, where deaths surpassed births. In January 2023, the South Korean Labor Ministry tried to remedy this by introducing more generous parental leave benefits, by giving new parents 18 months of leave, the longest duration in the world. On paper, this sounds fantastic. Parental leave is extremely important for both parents and infants, since it allows them to develop a stronger bond, aids in a baby's brain development, minimizes the risk of postpartum depression and infant mortality. It also increases overall job satisfaction and productivity. However, while time will tell if this policy will be enough to help South Korea's diminishing birth rate, it might not be enough. For starters, even though the policy allows for 18 months of leave, only 12 of those are paid. So if a parent needs those additional 6 months, they'll have to survive on no monthly income. Secondly, the only people who can take advantage of this policy is heterosexual couples who are both in full-time employment and receiving dual incomes. So single parents, gay and lesbian couples are left to go without. Lastly, the problem runs much deeper than the amount of time off that a parent gets. The issue lies with the labor market as a whole. As I've mentioned already, women are not only less likely to be hired simply due to their ability to become pregnant, but they also get paid less than men as well. Women who are employed may find it even harder to grow their career, since employers could feel even less inclined to advance someone who already took a year or more off of work for personal reasons. And with such low wages, along with the high cost of childcare and living, many women in South Korea are not only seen as less in the eyes of men, but there's a culture of silence in which they feel as though that if they do speak out, they'll face further persecution and have any chances at personal development and growth taken away from them. Given the situation, some people might be tempted to say, at least they're getting paid for their work, or if they stick with it, they'll probably get a promotion in time. But it's not that simple. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, out of its 38 members, South Korea has the worst gender pay gap between men and women, with a massive 31.2% difference. As for chances at promotion for women in South Korea, those are incredibly low too, with 21% of managerial positions being held by women and only 5% in executive positions. Given the drastic inequality and employers' indifference towards change, legislators may need to intervene. However, this might be challenging, as South Korea's legislature is heavily male-dominated, with only 19% of seats being held by women. Female policymakers also tend to enter the field later in life, after fulfilling societal expectations such as having and raising children, which means they potentially lack the accumulated experience of their male counterparts, who in general begin their careers much earlier. In South Korea, women have begun to speak out more forcefully about their experiences of mistreatment at work and in society as a whole. Their discontent with discrimination based on gender has sparked a wave of protests and social movements, providing them with a collective platform to express how they desire and deserve equality. Despite the fact that the term feminism and its associated ideologies are still considered taboo in some groups, including ones that are largely female, a growing number of women are embracing feminist ideals. As the #MeToo movement began to make headway globally, South Korean women actively participated, making it one of the most impactful movements in Asia. Their efforts to denounce sexual misconduct yielded significant results. In 2020, the movement achieved a remarkable victory when Mayor Oh Kyo-don of Busan resigned amid sexual harassment allegations. In the following year, in 2021, after several women came forward with accounts of assault and injury, Oh was sentenced to 3 years in prison. Predictably, this movement has sparked intense resistance from men who argue that women either already enjoy equal status or are receiving preferential treatment solely based on their gender, thereby purportedly depriving men of opportunities. Despite South Korea's rapid economic advancement in recent decades, significant economic disparities persist, with job prospects for all genders being both scarce and low-paying. This scenario, compounded by women's social activism, has led many men to perceive that women are exploiting the spotlight to secure financial and societal advantages over them. In recent years, there has been a notable surge in anti-feminist attitudes, particularly among young men. This backlash against women who advocate against mistreatment has been marked by hostility. In reaction, those opposed to feminism have intensified efforts to stigmatize its advocates further. In South Korea, feminism is sometimes likened to a mental illness, and the pejorative term femi is employed to label individuals supposedly afflicted by it. Consequently, asking someone if they're a femi essentially amounts to inquiring whether they have a mental illness. In online platforms and social media, anti-feminist views have gained significant traction, particularly in spaces frequented by young Korean men, such as those dedicated to hobbies like gaming and music. Platforms like YouTube have emerged as hubs for content that criticizes feminists, often portraying men as the primary victims in a supposed gender war. As highlighted earlier, gaming communities are particularly notorious for fostering toxicity towards women, both within the industry and, of course, towards female gamers. This kind of reaction towards feminism isn't unique to South Korea. There are numerous places in the world where men have responded to feminist activism in near identical ways. But the fight against feminism in South Korea has yielded some profound results in the world of politics. In 2022, the leader of the People Power Party, Yoon Suk-yeol, narrowly defeated the leader of the ruling Liberal Party, Lee Jae-myung. Yoon campaigned on the back of a variety of hardline conservative ideals, but one of the major tenets of his platform was that he would fight against feminists and their supposed misandry. In an attempt to appeal to young male voters, he echoed their beliefs in claiming that feminist movements were responsible for the lack of job opportunities available for men, along with the economic hardships that they face. To accomplish his goals, Yoon said that if elected, he would abolish South Korea's Ministry of Equality and Gender, an organization which he believes exists to undermine men and their presence in society by working primarily to support the needs of women above all else. Although a lot of men in South Korea believe this to be true, the function of the ministry isn't what many think it is. According to the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family itself, its aim is to plan and coordinate women's policy and improve women's status through enhancements of women's rights, establish, conciliate, and support for the family policy and multicultural family policy, foster welfare and protect youths, and prevent violence against women, children, and youth, as well as victims. Since its inception, the ministry has played an important role in protecting and representing women in South Korea. They've aided victims of domestic and sexual violence, prevented human trafficking and protected its victims, helped women who have been discriminated in the workplace, and much more. Originally, the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family was known as the Presidential Commission on Women's Affairs, but after accusations were made of them taking sides and encouraging reverse discrimination, the name was changed. Although the ministry may go by a different moniker now, there's still a widespread belief that it exists solely for the sake of women and to stoke the flames of an ongoing gender war. Yoon may be adamant about dissolving the Ministry of Gender Equality and Family, and there's a good chance that he might succeed, but he isn't the first to make these claims about the organization. There have been multiple attempts to dismantle the ministry throughout its existence, starting in 2006 after they established a policy to pay men to not hire sex workers for men's New Year's Day parties, and people tried to take them down again in 2018, 2013, and 2021. The Ministry of Gender Equality and Family clearly has a very important function, and it goes beyond simply helping women. Yet, despite their presence and the effects of women's rights movements in South Korea, it's evident that there's still a lot more work to be done. Men there may believe that power is being taken away from them, since many have now been held accountable for their actions against women, but that doesn't mean that the balance tipped anywhere close in favor of women, since at the end of the day, men are the ones who make the big decisions there, whether that's in the workplace, politics, or almost everywhere else for that matter. And even when it's not men in power making those decisions, the voices of men in South Korea's citizenry are heard far more clearly than anyone else's. Men are forgiven more easily and they're held less accountable as a whole. This remains true within the world of K-pop as well, where women idols are held to a much higher standard than their male counterparts. A performer like Hee Chul can go on drunk rants in front of a live audience, make bizarre statements, and share his misogynistic remarks, but he can mostly get away with it by posting half-hearted apologies. On the other hand, when singer Jang Won-young of the band IVE innocuously ate a strawberry with 2 hands, she received a deluge of cruel mockery, and when members of the band Alice posted a video of themselves eating strawberries in reference to this, they in turn were criticized and accused of mocking Won-young. The singer Sully, formerly of the band FX, was one of the most vocal women in the world of K-pop. As a person who suffered from social phobia and panic attacks, she was outspoken about mental health awareness. In a country where there's still a massive stigma attached to it, she also frequently appeared braless in public, along with posting images of herself online without one, and despite being criticized heavily for this, she stood by her actions, saying that it's uncomfortable to wear one and that people shouldn't police how women want to dress. Sully endured endless amounts of harassment and bullying from her followers online, many of which looked for any opportunity to criticize her for who she is and what she said. The overwhelming distress inflicted by Sully's critics eventually took its toll on her though, and she tragically took her own life at the age of 25. Sully's legacy still endures to this very day though, and women have become more outspoken about the unreasonable and demanding beauty standards that they're expected to follow. South Korea has become famous for its beauty industry, to the point where it's now the 3rd largest exporter of cosmetics in the world. As the world began to see more cultural exports from South Korea, such as their music and film, people got some idea of what their standards of beauty were. And after seeing female performers with gorgeous looks, flawless skin, silky, perfectly styled hair, and slim physiques, their image became something that millions of other people wanted to attain, both in and outside of South Korea. Looking like a K-pop star isn't easy though. Anyone that knows anything about makeup will tell you that even if you're genetically blessed, that will only get you so far when it comes to achieving certain beauty standards. And in South Korea, a lot of women find themselves very pressured to invest an obscene amount of time and money just to ensure that they're not criticized for their looks or not putting enough effort into their appearance, whether this is through something like a rigorous daily 10-step skincare routine or more drastic measures such as plastic surgery, which as of 2021, South Korea has the highest number of cases per capita in the world. Unlike in many other parts of the world, there isn't much of a stigma towards plastic surgery in South Korea, and for the sake of clarity, I'm not saying that there should be a stigma, but the fact that it's so common speaks volumes about the lengths women are expected to go to in order to achieve beauty. There's also the growing popularity of people undergoing skin whitening treatments, since lighter skin is often seen as a sign of higher status. South Korea's plastic surgery industry is now so popular and affordable that people from around the world travel there to receive treatment from their surgeons, with a total of 211,218 tourists visiting the country in 2019 specifically for surgery. South Korea may provide numerous and high-quality options for how they can change their appearance, but the expectation for them to do so can be crushing, to the point where if they fail to meet the beauty standards set by society and indeed the beauty industry that fuels it, it can be a detriment to their lives, like being criticized by loved ones, being ignored, ostracized, and even discriminated against, with 40% of women claiming that they lost out on job opportunities because they were judged on their appearance. And it's not uncommon for employers to go as far as requiring applicants to provide full body photographs of themselves, along with their measurements and weight. Those who have grappled with body image issues understand a certain paradox. While intellectually recognizing that societal pressures and media influences and beauty industry standards significantly contribute to body dissatisfaction, individuals often internalize negative self-perceptions. This tendency towards self-blame can arise when others in their lives fail to create a supportive environment that embraces and celebrates broader ranges of physical attributes bestowed by a person's genes. South Korean society teaches women to blame themselves for not looking perfect and meeting the standard set by its most conventionally beautiful members. And yes, this isn't unique to the country, it's a problem in most parts of the world. But when you can be rejected for an office job because your hips are too wide, or you can win 3 gold medals in the Olympics like professional archer An San and still be criticized because your hair is too short for a woman, it puts women of South Korea in a soul-crushing zero-sum game where they feel that they can never be enough. I've discussed subjects similar to this in the past before, and I've tried to make sense of why whenever women try to achieve equality in societies, it's met with oppositions by men who fear that they're going to take away all of their power, that they believe that the goal of women isn't to gain an equal footing, but to knock men off their pedestal entirely. The answer to this is complex and steeped in centuries of conflict between genders. But the simple answer is that those with a monopoly of power automatically assume that anyone beneath their station who asks for a greater share of power wishes to seize it all for themselves, and that even if they were to give an inch, they'd take a mile. I also try my best to be sympathetic towards men. After all, I am a man, and I would be lying if I said that there's never been a point in my life where I didn't understand or feel the sentiment. It's embarrassing to admit, but none of us have been perfect at every point in our lives. When you're a man and as you're being raised, you're told that if you do everything right, then the world will be your oyster as soon as you reach adulthood, only to find out that the job market is rigged and that even if you wear the right deodorant or the right clothes, women still won't throw themselves at you. It's easy to conclude that someone has cheated you out of what you were owed. When that happens, the powers that be put a lot of time and money into ensuring that you don't point the finger at them, and instead they manufacture an enemy that you're more familiar with, and maybe not on the best of terms with. In South Korea, the rise of feminist movements became a tool for politicians and corporations to garner favor with young men who felt alone and perhaps romantically unsuccessful. Men who didn't own a sports car by the age of 25, even though they were told it was a given. Men who saw other men that were perceptibly more successful than them at the same age, but they might not have noticed that they had a silver spoon dangling out of their mouths. These men are the ones who believe that they've been cheated out of a better life, and in that respect, they're right. But they've had their insecurities weaponized against them and been told that the reason why they sleep in bed at night with no one to reach out to is the same reason as why they're still buying suits off the rack for their 60 hours a week job while surviving off meals where the only prep is to add boiling water. The women of South Korea and elsewhere in the world where the fight for equality is ongoing simply want a place at the table. They don't want to be judged for their appearance. They want autonomy over their own bodies, proper compensation for their work, safety, and a voice that can be heard by as many people as possible without having to worry about it being muted due to their identity. All the same things that everyone else wants. They want to be seen while not being told how to present themselves to the world. The progress that feminists have made in South Korea just in the past few years has been remarkable, even in the face of strong opposition. That progress means something and deserves to be celebrated, regardless of how small or large those successes may be. And the fact that there are more women starting to feel comfortable about speaking out against discrimination is wonderful. Societies that refuse to protect its vulnerable members are deserving of criticism, regardless of where they are in the world and the composition of their population. I'd also be remiss if I didn't say that not every activist movement is perfect. Organizations like Magalia may have expressed a variety of bigoted views, which isn't acceptable, but those people don't represent women as a whole or their views. A few bad actors shouldn't be able to undermine the needs of a majority. Progress is slow, is painful, and is often met with setbacks that sometimes feel insurmountable, but it still needs to continue. Those of us with the lion's share of power need to ask ourselves not what we stand to lose by giving up some power, but what we stand to gain by giving some to those who desperately need it. David Bowie, born David Robert Jones, is one of the most prolific and influential artists of all time. Throughout his illustrious career, he recorded 26 studio albums and over 100 singles, which in total have sold over 100 million copies. In 1972, Bowie released his seminal album, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, where he adopted the persona of the titular Ziggy Stardust, an androgynous rock star alien who came to Earth to become its savior by uniting the world through their music, until they eventually succumbed to their ego. The album featured timeless classics like Starman, Moon Age Daydream, Ziggy Stardust, and Suffragette City, cementing Bowie's status as a glam rock icon. The album blended elements of jazz, blues, psychedelic rock, prog rock, and pop, creating a futuristic yet nostalgic vibe that felt truly original and otherworldly, much like Ziggy Stardust. It felt alien. The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars was and still is considered one of the greatest albums ever made, but not only did it serve as Bowie's first major step into stardom, it was the first of many indelible marks that he would make on the landscape of music. David Bowie has influenced countless artists. Notable acts such as the Beatles, Jay-Z, St. Vincent, The Killers, Gorillaz, Lady Gaga, Radiohead, and Queen have all drawn inspiration from Bowie's ever-evolving musical catalogue. In no uncertain terms, and without an ounce of hyperbole, David Bowie is a music legend. He also happens to be my favourite music artist. But even when you don't take my bias into account, there are few musicians in the world who have had such a meaningful and profound influence on music as David Bowie. Sadly, in 2016, after a protracted 18-month battle with liver cancer, David Bowie tragically passed away. The music world had lost an icon, but his legacy would forever remain. David Bowie's discography wasn't impeccable. After all, if you release 26 albums over half a century, there's bound to be some down points. But after he died, it saddened me because not only is he gone, it means I'll never hear any new music by him. He was an artist that transformed his style time and time again, but I won't get to see what he wanted to try next. It also made me think, who will be the next David Bowie? Who will be the person who transforms and influences music for decades to come? The answer to me was simple: no one. I say that not just because David Bowie was an anomaly. After all, there are plenty of other artists out there who managed to perform similar feats as him, but because that's just how music is now. We may have artists that have tens of millions of fans and have billions of plays on Spotify and YouTube and sell out massive stadiums, but it's not the same as what David Bowie did. In the world of music, popularity and influence aren't always intertwined. And although there are many modern artists out there who have had some influence on others, it doesn't come anywhere close to the likes of David Bowie. When considering the landscape of music in the 21st century and the influence of streaming services, it's natural to wonder who will stand the test of time like David Bowie. However, the rapid pace of media consumption and the fleeting nature of discussions facilitated by social media algorithms suggests that future icons may struggle to emerge. The way that we engage with music, film, and television has evolved, prioritizing short-lived trends and constant stimulation over enduring impact. This phenomenon raises doubts about whether any artist will achieve Bowie's level of lasting significance in the future. The nature of how media is produced and delivered to us is cynical, and we now have the conditions in which both artists and writers and other media producers, alongside audiences, are being robbed. Producers are unable to hold the attention of audiences long enough unless they're aided by aggressive marketing campaigns, and audiences aren't given long enough to enjoy something for it to matter before being ushered towards the next big thing. Our media has become disposable, and we should not be okay with that. Not too long ago, I made a video about TikTok and its effects on its users. I mentioned how human attention spans can't be quantified into a valid metric, and that's absolutely true, since our ability to pay attention to something differs from person to person and what we're paying attention to. Some people can read through a handful of chapters of a book in one sitting, some can only handle a few pages. It's all relative. The vast majority of people now listen to music through streaming services like Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube Music, and more. These services offer the most convenient method of listening to music ever made. If there's a song that you want to listen to, then not only are you almost guaranteed to find it on one of them, they're available almost instantly on any device. You can get all this for a very affordable subscription fee, which is about the price of a single CD album. There's also ad-supported listening, but it doesn't offer the same level of control a subscriber has. Streaming services leverage sophisticated algorithms to curate personalized playlists for users based on their listening habits. These algorithms analyze factors such as the genres and songs that you frequently listen to, the duration of the playtime, and interactions like liking or skipping tracks. By identifying these patterns in your listening behavior and comparing it to similar users, these algorithms generate playlists tailored to your taste. This feature allows users to discover new music while also enjoying familiar favorites, enhancing the overall listening experience. Obviously, this is incredibly convenient, especially when you compare it to how people used to listen to music in the past. However, listening to music this way has had a side effect on how we value music and its overall staying power. Consider how music was consumed in the past. A band or artist would release an album or single, and if you wanted to be able to listen to it whenever you want, you would have to leave the house, walk, drive, or take public transport to your nearest music retailer, hope that they have it in stock, purchase it, then go back home and play it on your stereo. There was even an element of risk attached to this. If you enjoyed a single from an artist, decided to buy the album it came from, there was every chance that the rest of the songs on it might not be as good. So you can feel as though you've wasted your money on a CD that has only one song on it that you like. After all, there wasn't any means of listening to an album before you bought it. Outside of purchasing physical media, other methods of listening included the radio, which served as a way of introducing people to new music, or if you were lucky, hearing a song that you know and like. And in the 1980s, MTV came along, which, much like the radio, would play a selection of songs throughout the day, but they were accompanied with video. Music consumption was kind of a crapshoot, with costs and risks attached to it, and it was nowhere near as convenient as what we have now. As I already mentioned, purchasing physical media could be costly for a lot of people. With streaming services, you pay just over $10 for millions of songs, but in the past, you had to pay that amount for something with about 10 to 12 songs on it from a single artist. As things stand now, if you don't like an artist's album, you can simply ditch it and switch to a playlist, knowing that the algorithm has something tailor-made for you, but with an album, that was your lot. At that point, your options were either to listen to an album that you know and love, or stick with your new purchase, listen to it a few more times, and hope that it'll eventually appeal to you. Of course, it's possible for this to happen with a streaming service if someone's willing to give something their time and attention, but with an access to a gigantic library of music, people are much willing to pass on something that doesn't appeal to them within a short window. And since music production has become so simple and cheap that basically anyone can record a track in their closet with a laptop and a microphone, the amount of music that's available to us is overwhelming. It's a double-edged sword because on one hand, it's great that artists can put their work out there with relative ease, but on the other hand, it means that their work gets buried under the thousands of daily new releases. The legacies of artists from the past were formed in part by familiarity with the audience, and that was partly due to the lack of convenience. There's an argument to be made that it's a fair trade since we as an audience benefit so much, but it's been known for a long time that our convenience comes at the cost of an artist's livelihood. Every music streaming service offers pitiful amounts of compensation to artists. To offer some perspective, here's how much a track earns per play and how many plays are required to earn $1,000 as of 2023. One of the most generous services is Tidal, which pays 0.0128 cents per play, requiring 78,125 plays for $1,000, which is somewhat surprising given how it's nowhere near as popular as its counterparts. Apple Music pays 0.008 cents per play, requiring 125,000 plays for $1,000. Spotify is 0.00318 cents, which translates into 314,465 plays for $1,000. And one of the lowest paying streaming services is, well, where you are right now, YouTube. At 0.002 cents per play, an artist would need their track to be heard approximately 500,000 times to earn only $1,000 through YouTube Music. Then there's Pandora and Deezer, which have worse payouts than all of the other streaming services out there. These earnings don't go directly to the artist either. In many cases, most of it goes to the label. Realistically, there's basically never been a worse time to be a working musician that's signed to a label. And for every megastar like Taylor Swift who's earned hundreds of millions of dollars from their music, there are hundreds of thousands of artists who have a few million plays on a streaming service but are earning about as much as a basic yearly salary. The absolute worst offender in the age of streaming music though isn't an app designed exclusively for music. It's TikTok, a platform which is universally despised by musicians and songwriters around the world, and for very, very good reason. TikTok is interesting in that it allows users to include licensed music in their videos without paying any additional fees. You can simply select it from their music library and add it. On YouTube, content creators such as myself have to either avoid using licensed music completely or come up with some kind of workaround. If YouTube finds that you're using a licensed song in your video without permission, then you can potentially have to forfeit any and all revenue that would otherwise go to the creator, and it would instead go to the music rights holder, even if it's something like 6 seconds of a song being used in a 2-hour video. So as much as I would have loved to have used some licensed music at the beginning of this video, I can't. I guess I should also take this opportunity to tell you that I actually have a Patreon, and if you want to support future content from the channel or help me have a sustainable income for a full-time YouTuber, any amount that you pledge goes a very, very long way. You also get ad-free early access to new videos too, which, is nice. TikTok has a unique arrangement with music labels though. Unlike on other streaming platforms, TikTok doesn't pay royalties based on how many times a track has been played in a video, but on how many times it has been included in an upload. You see, TikTok usually pays music labels with something called a blind check to allow TikTok and its users to include tracks in their videos, and this is often done without prior knowledge or consent from artists who work for the labels. This blind check is basically a flat fee which allows TikTok to include licensed music in their videos without having to pay out any form of royalties, regardless of how many times a song is heard. To illustrate how truly terrible this arrangement is for the artists who produce the music, let's look at the song Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush. After the 1985 song featured prominently in season 4 of Netflix's Stranger Things, it experienced a colossal surge in popularity online, resulting in it reaching number 1 in the music charts across several countries. The virality of the song extended into TikTok as well, where it was included in over 2.4 million video uploads, which collectively had over 5 billion plays. That's billion with a B. It was popular enough that if you browsed TikTok around the time that this was happening, then you were almost guaranteed to hear the song. However, And you can probably see this coming from a mile off, but I'll ask anyway. How much revenue do you think that Kate Bush earned from those 5 billion plays? Yeah, I won't even wait for an answer. You're correct. Zero. Zilch. $0 and 0 cents from TikTok, because her distributor, Warner Music Group, didn't establish any agreement in advance for revenue shares or a royalty-based agreement. You might be wondering at this point, how can TikTok get away with doing this? I mean, if you think about it, the labels themselves are kind of getting screwed over in this deal too, since they could be earning some serious money by having more revenue sharing agreements set up. But the answer is pretty simple. TikTok has become so massive and so important to the music industry that they now hold all the cards and have the final say-so on how the game can be played. TikTok is basically the digital equivalent of "I'll pay you an exposure," something that people who work in every creative field will have heard at some point in their career from some cheapskates who use their large, highly profitable platforms to exploit those who are less successful than them. Some people believe that even though TikTok doesn't compensate artists that appear on the platform properly, it's ultimately a good thing, because if they become viral on there, then that can be leveraged into success in other areas, such as more plays on streaming services, album sales, merchandise sales, and more people buying tickets for live shows. While there is some merit to this, popularity on TikTok does not automatically translate to success in other areas, and it most definitely does not guarantee long-term success. Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush may have had over 5 billion plays on TikTok, but by comparison, it had only 400 million plays on Spotify, the most popular music streaming service in the world. Yes, that's a very large number of plays, but it's only 8% of the plays that it had on TikTok. And yes, Kate Bush will have earned a decent amount of money from it, but it's evidence that popularity on TikTok is not even close to being a one-to-one exchange when moving to other platforms or revenue sources. And I know that I am repeating myself here, but it does bear repeating. Kate Bush didn't see a single penny from TikTok after her song was played over 5 billion times. In what universe is that okay? Oh yeah, this universe. The bad one. It's also worth mentioning that this translation will also get worse over time, since only 10% of 16 to 19-year-olds listen to Spotify globally, but a third of them use TikTok daily, meaning they'll be far less inclined to seek out a track that they like on another platform, and instead they return to TikTok to revisit a video which had a song that they like, since, unlike music streaming services, they don't have to pay for it. No matter which way you look at it, even though TikTok loves to claim that it serves as a springboard for new and established artists, it's a sentiment that comes with a lot of clauses attached to it, and none of them are in the favor of the artist. It affects their ability to survive as a working musician by cannibalizing their popularity on other platforms, and in regards to what this video is ultimately about, it's helped solidify the mindset that artists and the music they produce aren't worth emotionally or financially investing in. Some songs may reach hundreds of millions of ears, but when an app's algorithm wants you to listen to something else, it'll pull your attention elsewhere. Many artists across the industry and around the world have been extremely vocal about the state of the music industry and how we consume music, and the ways that it is heavily flawed. Musician James Blake made a cover of Frank Ocean's Godspeed, which ended up going viral on TikTok. And it turned out that neither he or Frank Ocean received any compensation from them and weren't credited for the song because it was listed as an original sound. He shared some of his insights by saying, if we want quality music, somebody is going to have to pay for it. Streaming services don't pay properly, labels want a bigger cut than ever, and just sit and wait for you to go viral. And in regards to the public's perception of music, he later added, the brainwashing has worked, and now people think that music is free. Blake is sadly correct. Too many people don't see music as something that requires effort to make or as something which is made by talented people who are genuinely passionate about expressing themselves through the medium. It just exists to accompany meme videos or something for a teenager to dance to on TikTok. It's cynical as all hell to say something like this, or even admit it to myself, since I'm a musician, and at one point in my life I had ambitions to work as one. And I know working musicians personally who genuinely care about making music. But God, does it hurt when I think of something as wonderful and unique as music being treated this way, as something that's just disposable. Although I've mostly focused on music in this video, I want to make clear that it's not the only victim in the era of abundant content. Film and television productions have also begun to feel as though they have less staying power, and even though some shows and movies are huge hits, both financially and critically, once again, it's the way in which we consume them that makes it so that they don't linger long enough to remain in the public's mind. And that method is, again, streaming. There is a ludicrous amount of streaming services available to us today, so many that it's not even worth listing them all. They each provide their customers with thousands of movies and shows to choose from, and companies like Netflix produce literally hundreds of them each year. Some shows will become extremely popular on places like social media shortly after they're released, but soon enough people will stop talking about it because something new has come out. And audiences who have been trained to be fickle by these companies that release these products practically forget all about the last thing, at least until the next season comes out. Sometimes. Netflix has also pioneered the binge model of content consumption, releasing an entire season of a TV show in one go, compelling some viewers to watch every episode in a very brief span of time, whether that's over a single week or even in one day. With the old model of watching television, people had to watch each new episode weekly, and during the wait for the next episode, people were given space to discuss the content that was being drip-fed to them. Since these shows were aired over the space of months and years, they remained in the public's eye long enough for them to actually become memorable. Binging, on the other hand, is just one and done. You watch it in a weekend, then you move on to something else. Season binging has its appeals because it removes the need to wait for the next episode, and producers encourage binging by including more cliffhangers in shows than what they used to. Many services still do weekly releases in hopes of keeping active subscribers over the span of a season. It's like regular TV, but you choose the time in which you watch it. Netflix's model of releasing all episodes at once, along with the way that the company judges whether a show gets renewed for another season, is extremely flawed though, and contributes to the phenomenon of disposable media. To keep it brief, Netflix releases an entire season of a show. The performance of that show is judged on how much of it viewers watch, but crucially, what matters most to them is how much is watched in the first week of release. If it underperforms, it's practically guaranteed to get axed. Netflix has gained an awful reputation for killing shows off after only one season, and because of this, it's ironically made matters worse, since many viewers have become reluctant to check out a show that they think looks interesting because they fear that it'll just get cancelled anyway, creating a vicious cycle where the odds of a show succeeding are extremely slim. It's safe to say that if you're making a show for Netflix, then don't include a cliffhanger at the end of season 1. You'll just leave people hanging. Many classic shows became classics because networks took a chance on them and renewed them even though the initial reception wasn't great. TV executives are, in general, extremely dumb. But every now and then, one of them will have a spark of genius and realize that some shows need time to grow. Shows like Seinfeld, Parks and Recreation, Everybody Loves Raymond, Breaking Bad, and even The Simpsons were all close to being cancelled after only one season, but some executives took a chance and they all became huge hits. Netflix doesn't care about potential, they just want something to be a hit within moments of its release. It's a completely broken model, and I can't believe that they're continuing with this. I'll tell you a secret though, if you really want to make a hit Netflix show, just throw in a scene where there's a dance routine. People on TikTok will imitate it, that'll go viral, then people will watch your show. I mean, hey, it works for Wednesday, even though Wednesday Addams wouldn't be caught dead dancing, quite literally. Then there's the other problem, oversaturation. There's simply too much content out there and not enough time to watch it. Marvel has been especially bad about this. When the franchise was first popular, if you wanted to keep up with the story, you only had to watch 6 films over the course of a few years. But in one of their most recent phases, Phase 4, you would have to watch 9 TV seasons on Disney Plus and 9 movies. This first phase of Marvel was 744 total minutes of watch time. Phase 4, with all 18 products, amounts to a watch time of 4,113 minutes. That's 68 hours of content, almost 3 days all in all. As great as it is to have all of these choices available to us at any given time, we simply have to admit that there are some critical flaws with this model for both us as consumers and the people that produce the things that we enjoy. The first album that I ever bought was OK Computer by Radiohead. The album had been out for a long time at this point, but I remember hearing the songs No Surprises and Paranoid Android, and since I liked them, I figured that I'd give the album a try. I didn't take to it right away, but after a few listens, it resonated with me in ways that I'd never experienced before. It was my first step on a lifelong journey to discover more music that would speak to me, and to this day, it's still my all-time favorite album, and I can still enjoy it the way I did when I first listened to it. I know that how I listen to music is different to most people now. I do use Spotify, and I have a curated playlist of almost 650 tracks on there, which I turn to when I want some variety, but I still like listening to albums. With music consumption being what it is now, it makes me think, what might other people be missing out on by using something like TikTok or a Spotify daily mix exclusively, by not exploring what's out there or not giving an artist enough of their time to leave their footprint? What if they never have their OK Computer moment because a few seconds of a song wasn't enough to appeal to them? The audience is deprived and the artist is starving. As things stand, the only winners are the labels who are happy to leave musicians in the dust after they've had their moment in the sun, and tech companies who rob them of a living. They created the dagger, which sits in between the ribs of every struggling artist's back, but we're the ones who keep pushing it in deeper. At this point in time, artists can, theoretically, get more exposure than they've ever had in the past, and the industry is still insanely profitable. Musicians are a tool to them, to be used and then discarded once their 15 minutes are up. Physical media may have been inconvenient, but it meant something, and it was an unspoken agreement between you and an artist which symbolized a level of commitment between them, that a CD, tape, or vinyl in your collection now had some place in your life. How often you returned to it depended on how much you liked it, but there was more of a potential for you to love it, and for legends to be made because it had a home. It wasn't just attached to a 30-second video or a daily mix. Music is way too special to be treated in such a way, and we need to recognize that. It shouldn't be the case where artists have to game the algorithm by releasing multiple versions of the same track just to find some traction on TikTok. If we give up on musicians and refuse to support their ambitions, most of the music that we'll hear will either be designed by committee just to reach the widest audience possible, or worse, generated by an AI which leeches off the work of humans. I really don't mean to sound like I'm some boomer saying things were better back in the old days or anything like that, but there is no doubt that the old methods of enjoying music, although often inconvenient, provided artists with the recognition and dignity they deserved. There may never be another David Bowie, but we should still be able to do better for our artists. If there are any musicians or singers whose music that you love, then if you can afford it, try to support them in ways that aren't plays on Spotify. Physical media is sadly dying, which is a problem unto itself. But you can still buy CDs, and the vinyl market is very much alive. Even if you don't own a record player, it's still nice to have something that you can hold, and a lot of vinyl looks really neat. If you can't buy something physical, then Bandcamp is a great option. The lion's share of the purchase goes directly to the artist. Many of them allow you to pay whatever you want, and you can download them as an MP3 or FLAC file. Merchandise can also be a great tangible way of offering your support. Although if you're a woman wearing a band t-shirt, there's a chance that you might have to prove your fandom to a white guy in his 30s wearing cargo shorts who asks you to name at least 5 B-sides. You know who you are, guys. Other than that, go see them live if you can. Some of my best moments in my life have involved seeing my favorite bands live, and I'm sure that you'll make those moments for yourself too. For those of you living in the US, I do fully understand that this is easier said than done, since those pricks at Ticketmaster have a monopoly over ticket sales here, and it can get so expensive that you'll practically have to take out a mortgage just to watch from the lawn. Lots of smaller artists have very reasonable ticket prices though, so if they're around your area, try to check them out. It'll honestly be so worthwhile. Plus, they usually play at smaller venues, which, believe me, is so much better than watching them in a stadium. Music will never die. But if things keep going as they are, it'll soon be on life support. It won't be this living, breathing, ever-changing thing. It'll just be static. Technically alive, but just there, existing in the backgrounds of our lives, and unable to remind us why it matters so much. So please, support musicians, support creators, and long live art. So I think it's pretty clear now I have no distinct theme for my channel and the subjects I talk about, so we're going to talk about movies this time, if that's alright. So if we're going to talk about movie theaters dying off, then I need to make a confession. I'm part of the problem. I haven't seen a movie at the theater or paid for a ticket in almost 5 years now. It's not because I don't like movies. In fact, film has been an incredibly important part of my life. I've watched hundreds of them, studied them at college and university, and I even rate and track what I've seen on Letterboxd, although I haven't been keeping up with it very well lately. I haven't fallen out of love with movies. There are still some incredible and innovative films still being released, but when I look at what's playing on screens near where I live, I mostly just see back-to-back showings of Blockbuster movies, which I'm not really interested in. I also have to admit that I just don't like the theater experience anymore, and I kinda have to blame the audience for that. The last few times I went to watch a movie in a theater, there was trash all around, suspicious wet marks on armrests, people talking out loud, using their phones with the volume on, creating content for their socials, and there were parents who brought their very young children with them to watch an R-rated movie with some graphic violence. Even though I've seen movies at a theater dozens of times throughout my life and had lots of amazing experiences, I think I'm finally over it. I don't know what I might be getting into by going to see a movie at the theater, but I do know what I'll get at home. Cheaper snacks, a familiar couch, better hygiene, no annoying audience, a pause button, bathroom breaks, volume control, and if I need it, subtitles. I am perfectly fine watching a movie on our modestly sized living room TV with a modest soundbar if it means that I don't have to step into a theater again, and considering that the kinds of films that I enjoy now end up being put on streaming services directly because movie studios know that they won't bring in $1 billion, I guess you can say that we sort of have an understanding with each other now. Now, I know that everything I just said has a lot of old man yells at cloud energy to it, but I'm not alone. And since the advent of COVID-19, people like me are slowly becoming the majority. And as you can guess from the video title, that's partly why movie theaters are dying off. It's not just the annoyances of actually going to see a movie though, but we'll get into that as we go along. I'm sure that for many of you, this comes as a surprise. After all, many of the movies released in recent years have raked in over $1 billion at the box office, an amount which any film studio would consider a resounding success. Some of these movies gain a lot of public attention too, where they're frequently discussed online. Memes and other content are made that are based on them, sensationalizing them enough that it convinces other people to go see a movie just so they don't miss out on something. There's also the fact that out of the 50 highest grossing movies ever made, 33 of them were released in the past 10 years alone, with every one of them bringing in over $1 to $2 billion each. Clearly, money is being made. Tickets are being bought, and people are still watching movies. So, how is it that movie theaters are dying off around the world? Well, let's look at the theater-going experience first. For starters, for most people, going to see a movie is not cheap. If you're a family of 4, it can cost almost $100, and that's not even taking into account the cost of snacks, which, if you've ever gone to see a movie with a kid, good luck walking past the concession stand without hearing any complaints from them. Movie theater snacks, drinks, and popcorn are famously overpriced, especially popcorn, which has such a high profit margin that it's practically kept some theaters from closing completely. But when you factor all that into the equation, a trip to see a movie isn't exactly what most people would consider a cheap night out. Honestly though, just smuggle in your snacks. Get a satchel or a handbag, preferably one with a few discreet compartments, then stuff them in there. Maybe cover them with like a scarf or a t-shirt, whatever really. Theater attendants really don't get paid enough to care. You can also make something up like, these are prescription Skittles. I have to taste the rainbow once every 12 hours. The average AMC movie ticket price in the US is around $12, higher than the global average of approximately $9.63 per ticket as of 2023. The US has always been one of the most important and lucrative markets for box office sales, boasting some of the highest attendance rates and financial returns worldwide, which, as you can probably surmise, is partly due to the high cost of seeing a movie here. Additionally, both China and India have higher overall theater attendance, which is not surprising given their status as the 2 most populous countries in the world, coupled with their lower ticket prices compared to the US. These countries are significant markets for Hollywood, particularly China. However, the US has always been the most lucrative market, making the recent decline in attendance particularly impactful. The movie theater experience is also something that many people are finding harder to tolerate. As I mentioned near the start, the viewing experience can be hindered by things such as technical issues with the theater or audience members who have little respect for other people's enjoyment and comfort. You don't have to look far on YouTube or TikTok to find clips of people getting into arguments or even full-blown fights in movie theaters, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. For people who just want to sit down and enjoy the full cinema experience without distractions, it's enough to convince them not to return, at least that's how I feel. Other than the actual theater-going experience, which is starting to feel like an expensive gamble, there's also the problem of variety. The movie industry, especially major studios, have become increasingly reliant on a narrow selection of genres, and each of them require astonishingly high budgets to produce. The exception to this is horror movies, which in general are considered a safe bet, since they're fairly inexpensive to produce compared to a blockbuster movie, and they're popular among teens, young adults, etc. They're mostly profitable. Other than horror, the genres you'll most commonly find showing in theaters these days are blockbuster superhero or franchise films with $200 million budgets, sequels, reboots, and remakes of well-established IPs, adaptations from other media properties, spin-offs, and CG animated movies. All of these categories can best be described as a safe bet. You know what to expect from a superhero movie. Blockbusters all have a similar template to each other and are accompanied with gigantic marketing budgets. Sequels, reboots, and remakes are obviously recognizable since they have a legacy, and CG animated movies have a broad generational appeal, especially to children. All of these genres have sort of been engineered to fill the audience's needs and wants from a movie, and in turn have created the conditions in which studios feel less of a need to produce films with a singular genre focus. To clarify, let me ask you, When was the last time that you saw a movie released in theaters nationwide that was just a straight up comedy or even romantic comedy? It's been a good while, right? You'll see them on streaming services like Netflix, and I'll get to the reasons behind that in a bit. But compared to the past, you barely ever see them in theaters, and that's because they're almost never billion-dollar earners. They can do well, but not well enough to be shown in theaters, to be put on screens. You see, movie studios have sort of taken the P.T. Barnum approach to entertainment now, where they want movies to have a little bit of everything for everyone. They release these large budget movies with the expectation of them bringing in at least $1 billion, and they include all aspects that an audience could ask for. Take Marvel movies, for example. If you want drama, there's drama. If you want comedy, there's jokes. If you want action, there's lots of it. If you want romance, there's love interests. Something for everyone. But in general, there's not enough of one thing to satisfy a specific taste. Unless it's action, since every single one of these movies seems to end with 45 uninterrupted minutes of horribly edited VFX-filled panic attacks. Now, I'm not going to say that people don't want these types of films, because that would be categorically wrong. If we look again at those top 50 highest grossing movies, you'll see that most of them are franchise movies, sequels, adaptations, and so on. It's not necessarily a recent discovery, because even in the 80s and 90s they found that sequels were popular, but new IPs with a theatrical release are rarer than they've ever been now compared to then. The movie industry has figured out that in general it's better to play it safe with the kind of films it produces, and that means catering, or arguably pandering, to people's feelings of familiarity and nostalgia. Part of this is because they're ideas that are easy to sell, since unlike a new property, people know what they're getting into. Like, people know what Ghostbusters is. So with a movie like the recent Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, you don't have to put in a ton of effort to explain the concept to people, since it's based on a beloved property using the same name and identical iconography to the original. The property speaks for itself. Yes, marketing is important, since you want people to actually know that the film exists, and it can be a challenge to get younger audiences interested since they'll be less familiar, but nostalgia does most of the legwork. Saying that, Frozen Empire didn't do too great. It made just over $200 million global on a $100 million budget, but considering that marketing costs are roughly about a third of a film's budget, it barely broke even. The big budget movies that audiences have familiarity with have had a lot of successes, an obscene amount, but fatigue is setting in. The general public is getting bored with them, and last year we saw numerous movies released that studios probably safely assumed would bring in a cool $1 billion. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, which marks the beginning of Marvel's fifth phase of movies, had a disappointing box office return. It had a gigantic $326.6 million budget, but only brought in $476.1 million, and once again, if you factor in the marketing cost, that'll be a loss. The Marvels made a loss of $237 million, even though it featured Captain Marvel, who in her solo movie brought in $1 billion. Warner Bros. The Flash lost $155 million, even though it was based on a recognizable property. Disney has had a streak of failures with their CG animated films, one of the worst being Wish, which lost $131 million, and Indiana Jones, a legacy franchise with millions of fans across multiple generations, lost $143 million with its latest sequel, The Dial of Destiny. These are all big name, big budget movies from studios with seemingly infinite production and marketing budgets, and although they pumped billions into these films, audiences ultimately responded with a resounding, "Who cares?" I just want to add, and this is just me spitballing here, maybe part of the problem is because movie trailers these days are terrible. They don't properly communicate the plot, the kind of movie it is, or what makes it different from others. It's just all vibes. In fact, part of the problem is that trailers for big budget films feel far too similar to each other, and nothing stands out as a result. Maybe we should bring back the In a World trailer guy, you know? What? He's dead. When? Alright. I'll do it. In a world where bees love jazz.
You like jazz?
To me, the failure of Ghostbusters: Frozen Empire and the new Indiana Jones might be a sign that people are finally becoming tired of nostalgic properties. In the past decade, we've been given endless amounts of revivals and reboots, and it's only natural that people will get tired of it. Nostalgia may be a drug, but like any other drug, you can build a tolerance to the point where it just doesn't do anything for you anymore. By the way, I did a video on nostalgia and why it's bad for you a while back. Check it out, it's one of my favorites, and that's saying something because I think my videos suck. That being said, please support me on Patreon if you can, because I need to make a living off this, and YouTube pays terribly. So yeah, that stuff matters. Any amount you can offer, it's fine, it's fine. It's fine. Movie studios don't like to think about it, but movie-going audiences genuinely do want new things, or at the very least, different things. The problem with that is that different things are considered a risk. It's harder to sell when you try to market something that doesn't have much or any pre-existing familiarity, but audiences do miss seeing things that are simply different to what else is being offered. Barbie may have been based on a popular toy franchise, but the movie itself was different and interesting and ended up earning almost $1.5 billion in the box office. There was a caveat in that it was a rare instance in which the marketing budget was slightly larger than the production budget, but it paid off. Oppenheimer was successful because it had some pedigree to it, with Christopher Nolan being the director, and that's something you see less of these days. Movies that bring in audiences because of the director attached to it. Movies by Steven Spielberg used to be a big deal, but it's not like that anymore. Even legendary directors like Martin Scorsese have begun to release their films directly onto streaming services with financial backing from them, because big movie studios don't want to put money into something that isn't going to pull in $1 billion. The dominance of well-known franchises presents a dilemma for movie theaters. While theater operators, particularly those in smaller, non-franchise establishments, may wish to diversify their offerings, they're constrained by audiences' demands. The general public tends to prioritize big-budget, big studio-produced films, leaving these theaters with little choice than to cater to this demand in order to remain viable. However, even this strategy may not be sufficient to ensure survival, as operating a movie theater entails significant financial expenses. Very quickly, hopefully, let's go over some costs. First and foremost, there's the building itself, which, since theaters serve only one purpose, they have to be built from scratch, and they usually require land acquisition. Building or leasing a theater with multiple screens can cost on average up to $30,000 per month. There's the cost of staff, point of sale systems, utilities, and inventory like snacks and cleaning equipment, all of which can vary in cost dramatically depending on the size of the operation. There's also insurance and legal services, the former being anything from $30,000 to $60,000 a year on average. The technology behind showing the actual movies is where the costs can really stack up though. Firstly, there's the media block, which converts the data from a studio into a movie. These can average at about $14,000 and be as high as $40,000. Theaters also need a server to store movies too, which will run you anywhere from $12,000 to $27,000. Then there's the screen, which can be as little as $3,000 for a basic 30-foot white matte screen, or $12,000 for a silver premium large format screen, or PLF. Installed new, it can cost as much as $50,000. Of course, you'll need a projector and a sound system as well. Theaters have started to switch over to laser projectors, which have benefits over other models. They're capable of higher image fidelity and brightness, they don't require expensive bulbs or intensive cooling, and they use 70% less electricity. They also have a lifespan of about 10 to 15 years. However, they are expensive. Prohibitively expensive. For a standard screen, they can cost about $40,000, and for a PLF screen, they can be as high as $150,000. Laser projectors also have different requirements to make them work, like repositioning the projection booth entirely. which can potentially mean that theaters have to remove an entire row of seats to accommodate it, and therefore sell less tickets for a showing. Lastly, for a Dolby Atmos sound system, you're looking at a $75,000 to $100,000 bill. I'm not even going to tally up all of the costs here, but if you want to have a theater with 8 screens, which is generally considered the ideal number, you're looking at a few million in costs just to get started up. And that number can skyrocket if you have more elaborate technologies like IMAX or 4DX theaters. All of this is done to convince audiences that if you want the best experience when watching a movie, then the theater is the best place to go. There's a problem though, and it's not just the cost of a ticket or the theater quality. The problem is that regardless of how amazing and immersive the movie theater experience may be, not enough people care to make a difference. And how a movie is experienced isn't too important to most people. You see, in the past, watching a movie in the theater was a much easier sell, and that was because the quality and affordability of home theater technology available to consumers was much worse than what we have now. Back in the 90s, most people would have something like a 25-inch full-screen format CRT TV in their living room. For audio, they'd use the built-in speaker, and if they wanted to watch a movie, they'd have to wait for it to air on TV, pay for premium channels on cable or satellite, or buy or rent a movie on VHS and later DVD. All of these were pretty damn expensive, and even if you dished out the cash for something fancier, it still wouldn't come anywhere close to the theater experience. The home viewing experience simply couldn't compete with the movie theater. Cut to present day though, and the cost to have a high quality movie viewing experience is insanely low by comparison. Take a look at this Best Buy flyer from 1998. If you wanted to buy a 36-inch Philips Magnavox full-screen CRT TV with a $50 saving, it's $899.92, which in today's money is $1,733.97. Today, if you wanted to buy a 65-inch flat-screen television with 4K resolution, high dynamic range, and smart TV functionality, it is a paltry $399, which in 1998 would only be $207. And bear in mind, TVs go on sale all the time, so if you wait a little bit, you can probably get it cheaper than that. In fact, why not include a fairly cheap soundbar, like this $98 Sony one? It's not high-end, but it's way better quality than the TV speakers, and when you add it to the cost, it's still cheaper than the Philips Magnavox on its own. Obviously, this doesn't compare to the likes of watching a movie on a 50-foot screen with a huge sound system to accompany it, but for most people, myself included, it's more than enough. In fact, the TV in our living room is smaller than the one I just mentioned, and I'm fine watching Oppenheimer on it. Even if it would make Christopher Nolan cry himself to sleep if he heard that. It doesn't count if you watch my movies on a telly. Stop watching it on your phone. I made Batman. Some people, namely teens and young adults, are perfectly fine watching an entire movie on their phone while using the built-in speakers, which director David Lynch has some very strong opinions on.
It's such a sadness that you think you've seen a film on your telephone. Get real.
I can't say I'd like to do that myself, but it just goes to show. People care less and less about the way in which they watch a movie, and instead prioritize the cost and ease in which they can watch one. Younger generations as a whole are becoming less interested in watching movies and television. In a study conducted by Deloitte, nearly half of Gen Z respondents and a third of millennials prefer watching live streams and video content on sites like YouTube and TikTok, and only 24 and 27% of respondents respectively saying that they prefer new and old TV shows. Rather shockingly though, a meager 11% of Gen Zs and 18% of millennials said that they prefer new and old movies. The shift away from streaming services among Gen Zs and millennials can be attributed to several factors. Social video sites expanding selection of custom, brief, and up-to-date content, and the free accessibility of the material are chief among these reasons. They also believe that streaming services aren't as good at providing tailored content as platforms like YouTube, and they're becoming too expensive, with more than 50% of both generations reporting cancelling a subscription in the last 6 months. With streaming services regularly raising their prices, this trend is likely to persist. Look at the option. Either travel a few miles to a building, pay $20 for a ticket, and hope that all the conditions are right for you to enjoy the movie which you may or may not like, or use the equipment that you already own in the comfort of your home to watch the same thing for a fairly cheap price. The more you think about it, the easier the choice becomes. It's like, have you ever seen one of those pics of something like a Big Mac that's been deconstructed to look like a gourmet cuisine? The movie theater experience has kind of become like that. It's nicer, and maybe it enhances it, but when you watch a movie at home, it's still the same product, except now the Big Mac looks like it did when you got it from the drive-thru. It's the same taste, just a different experience, and most people are fine with the taste alone. Movie studios are responsible for this though, where potential customers are fine staying at home to watch their movies. Before COVID-19, people had already become accustomed to watching movies at home either through streaming services like Netflix or digital rentals and purchases. The selection available to them was and still is gigantic, so even if you don't have a movie you want to watch in mind, it's easy enough to browse around and find one. When the pandemic started and people had to stay indoors and theaters around the world closed their doors, some permanently, movie studios still had film releases lined up though, but with no big screens to put them on, they kept delaying the release dates for their tentpole blockbuster movies. But when it became apparent that the pandemic wasn't coming to an end anytime soon, they decided to swallow their pride and make them available to watch at home via streaming. One of the most notable cases was Disney's 2020 Mulan remake, which ended up having its plans for a theatrical run scrapped entirely in favor of releasing it on Disney Plus's premium service for an additional rental fee of $29.99 US. This might seem like a lot, and if you wanted to watch the movie solo, it is, but consider the fact that Disney is all about family movies, so for that family of 4 that I mentioned earlier, it goes from being a $100 theater visit to only $30. Other studios did the same, and Warner Brothers even went so far as to release their movies on Max without any additional rental fees, which was kind of a mind-blowing move. Not everyone in the industry was happy with it, but you better believe audiences were. This was pretty much the turning point, and the audience's relationships with how they watch movies was forever transformed, and no amount of fancy theater technology could convince all these people to keep paying for tickets. Movie theaters have opened their doors again, but people, such as myself, are more than fine watching from their couch. Even if there's a movie that you want to watch that's only showing in theaters but you don't want to pony up for a ticket, you don't have to wait very long to see it at home. Many releases go from the theater screens to your home screens within a matter of weeks. To give you a recent example, Dune 2 released in theaters on March 1st this year, and by April 16th it was available at home. If you're not a die-hard Dune fan, then a month and a half wait really is nothing. This is another thing that was different in the past. Big movies were given more time in the theater because that's how people wanted to watch them. Titanic, for example, was released on December 19th, 1997 in the US, and it stayed on screens until October 1998, almost an entire year. Could this be considered consumer unfriendly since it deprives them of viewing options? Sure, but the movie theater meant something back then. And it wasn't a case where you had movie studios dumping out one blockbuster after another throughout the entire year, oversaturating the market with homogeneous, forgettable movies that feel as though they only exist to keep you entertained for 2 hours of your life until you find another one to occupy your time. Movies are important and have been pivotal in shaping our culture in both good ways and bad. But that's testament to their power. The remakes, reboots, and sequels that we see today are only possible because in the past, we saw movies as something far more valuable than what they are now. Theaters are a place where you would go, where you would sit in a room for a few hours, and what you saw there would leave an impression on you for the rest of your life, and that is a really beautiful thing. To movie studios, Those precious memories have turned you, the audience, into a demographic, so some of your cherished moments can be monetized in hopes that you can relive a joyous time in your life where reality didn't feel like a gauntlet of disappointments. I don't blame audiences for falling for it because I would like that too. And I've taken my fair share of weaponized nostalgia too. Nostalgia is losing its value though, and although movie studios have successfully gotten audiences to watch movies that are familiar to them over and over again, they're failing to capture the nostalgia of actually going to the movie theater, to go and see something that feels like it actually meant something. If movie studios just lightened up on their perverse need to make every movie earn $1 billion and gave modest budgets to new ideas that actually intrigue people enough to get them out of their houses to go and see it at the cinema, then we'd all benefit. Given how we consume media nowadays, with it being an endless stream of content available to all of us at all times, I don't think it's possible for there to be any more classic films that span generations, but that doesn't mean that we need to be spoon-fed nostalgic properties that invoke the classics to make up for it. People want new and different ideas. Even if they don't realize it, they do. Any industry that hedges its bets almost exclusively on the expensive risk and tries to mitigate that risk by throwing even more money at it for marketing only has itself to blame when audiences eventually get tired of what they're offering. I don't know whether movie theaters need saving outside of the historic ones. Maybe they're just becoming a relic of the past now that it's so cheap and easy to have a good movie viewing experience at home. I've always had a feeling that in time, movie theaters would end up becoming a place where they exclusively show blockbuster movies, and that has kind of come true. Now that that isn't enough anymore, I really don't know what comes next. Maybe most of them end up shutting down, and the few that remain start charging hundreds of dollars for a ticket and market it as a premium experience for those privileged enough to be able to pay for it. Maybe they'll make tickets cheaper and hope that'll attract people, or let you drink directly from the butter dispenser if you buy a large popcorn with a ticket. Maybe they'll just disappear and end up becoming supermarkets. Maybe things are just different now. But different isn't always a bad thing. It's just different. Take care. I should get a real job. But I'm not a salary man. I'm Salari, man. Gross. If you've been following me for a bit now, you'll know that I love baking. I'm always looking to expand my horizons by trying new and more difficult things, simply to see if I'm capable of it. While I do enjoy a good challenge, one of my favorite things to make is a simple loaf of white bread. I first made it when I moved to America and found that store-bought bread was loaded with sugar. So I thought to myself, why not try making it? I found a recipe from a reputable baker and just went for it. White bread has 5 simple ingredients: 400 grams of bread flour, 8 grams of salt, 25 grams of unsalted butter, or about 30 milliliters of olive oil if you want a vegan option, 250 milliliters of cool water, and most importantly, 7 grams of active dry yeast. Other than those, the only thing you need is some time, patience, and a bit of elbow grease doesn't hurt, or a stand mixer if you're lazy like me. You mix up the ingredients in a single bowl and you add water and move them all around. That's where the magic happens. As the ingredients intermingle with one another, it creates a network of proteins, which is all these strings forming together. There's an interesting science behind the creation of bread, but little of this was known when it was first created. What makes bread fascinating to me is that despite its complexity, it's an ancient creation. It's old enough that there's no solid consensus on when it was invented. There's evidence that it could be as old as 30,000 years old, and after all that time, it's been a staple in cultures across the entire world, to the point where it's referred to in numerous religious texts. It's delicious, versatile, nourishing, and above all, underrated. Bread came into existence because some brilliant people millennia ago discovered the miracle of yeast and fermentation, and was born from the desire to create something new, different, and filling. So what's the difference between bread and something that you'd find at a 3-star Michelin restaurant? Fine dining is all about taking ingredients and discovering new and complex ways of turning them into a dish that the average person couldn't imagine. Some would even go as far as to say that it's art or even performance, since the way it's presented to a diner is often, well, performative. Like a magician's trick that you get to witness the result, but what happens behind the scenes is a mystery that heightens the reveal, the feeling of, how did they do that? They're made by people who want to elevate food beyond most people's understanding of it. But with the creation of food, there's always the question, what was the cost behind making it? And I'm not just talking about the monetary value, but the cost on an ecological, human, and societal scale. Is the creation and sale of fine dining worth it beyond its taste and presentation? I don't believe so. Philosophically, I am not a fan of fine dining and have never been to a fine dining restaurant. Some people might think that I lack credibility, but most people, like my wife and me, can't afford $600 per person for bite-sized dishes. Criticism should be allowed regardless of one's direct experience. I can critique the diamond industry without owning diamonds. The best chefs in the world have for years been cultivating and romanticizing the idea that unique and innovative dishes can only be created through excessive dedication to your work, spending every waking moment thinking about food, allowing yourself to be exploited for your labor with the aim of improving your art, and in many cases forming a cult-like attachment to the masters. There are two pieces of media I want to look at as part of this video, which explore the world of fine dining from different angles: the FX show The Bear and the 2022 film The Menu, directed by Mark Mylod and written by Seth Rice and Will Tracy. Both The Bear and The Menu have received widespread acclaim from both critics and audiences, especially The Bear, which is currently considered to be one of the best shows on television. The Bear's story goes between being a drama about family and the traumas that come with that, and what goes into the creation of complex dishes and running a restaurant. But as the show has progressed, there's been an increasing emphasis on its fine dining elements, including how incredible it is and its importance in the culinary world. For those of you who don't know, The Bear is about the young prodigy Carmen Bazzato, aka Carmi, who after years of training at some of the world's finest restaurants, returns home following the tragic death of his brother, and after inheriting his ailing sandwich restaurant, he aims to turn it around. When he first arrives at the restaurant, it's a bit of a mess. The staff are untrained and apathetic, the kitchen and dining area are a disaster, the food is sloppy, and Carmi's cousin Richie has been trying to run things in his own unique and terrible way, by which I mean yelling and getting in the way of everyone. I will say though that those sandwiches do look pretty damn good. On a few occasions, The Bear gives us an insight into Carmi's experiences during his time learning from world-class chefs, and it shows that part of this process meant withstanding the emotional abuse of Chef David Fields, played to perfection by Joel McHale. As Carmi painstakingly prepares elaborate dishes, Fields hovers over him, whispering insults into his ear, belittling his skills, questioning Carmi's presence in his kitchen, telling him that he's worthless, and other abusive behaviors. But Fields is the best, so Carmi puts up with it. McHale himself has said that the character of David Fields was based upon the real-life chef Thomas Keller. This happens early into season 1, and with its inclusion, many assume that The Bear was making a clear statement that the cost of becoming one of the best chefs in the world is too high for anyone, and that the methods some chefs use to cultivate talent are too toxic to justify the creation of haute cuisine. As the show progressed though, it seemed to step away from this thesis. Throughout the first season, my and many other people's assumption was that by working at a sandwich restaurant, Kami would rediscover the value of creating simple, delicious foods that don't require intense prep and sourcing expensive, exotic ingredients, something which I personally like the idea of, but at the end of season 1, they made it clear that it wasn't going to be the case. The menu, on the other hand, revolves around an escort called Margot Mills, played by Anya Taylor-Joy, after she's invited by a client to a high-class exclusive restaurant on a secluded island run by renowned chef Julian Slowik, played by Ralph Fiennes. After some time there, it becomes apparent that something much darker is afoot, and Slowik doesn't intend to let his diners leave the island alive, and produces a bespoke menu that reveals their secrets and vulnerabilities, with the final course being a performative piece in which he and his staff and all the diners perish. The film is sort of a dark comedy, and as you can guess, a satirical take on the world of fine dining. It looks at how it's seen by outsiders, people who worship chefs, food critics that determine the success of restaurants, and of course, the wealthy, including those who see art as something to be exploited to earn money. The Bear and the Menu have a similar thesis on the creation of food, but clearly differ in various ways. The Menu is a critique on what the dining experience and the culture surrounding it has become, whereas The Bear kind of oscillates between examining the flaws of fine dining and borderline worshipping it. As I said a moment ago, The Bear begins with Kami inheriting his brother's struggling sandwich restaurant. Kami tries to turn things around using his culinary experience by buying quality ingredients with his limited funds, changing how things are run in the kitchen, training the other employees, and showing how they can do things better, even though none of them are really keen on the idea at first. They're all seemingly just fine making Italian beef sandwiches. Shortly after starting at the restaurant known as The Beef, aspiring chef Sydney Adamu applies for a job there, knowing that the prestigious chef Kami has become the head chef and is understandably confused as to why he chose to work at The Beef, but nonetheless, she wishes to learn from him and takes the job. The restaurant also came with a substantial amount of debt, thanks to Kami's late brother Mikey's mismanagement, who also borrowed money from their uncle Jimmy to start it up. Things are bad, and even though Kami does his best to improve the quality of the food and the efficiency of the kitchen, it's an uphill battle. That is, until he discovers a bunch of money Mikey left behind in some tomato sauce cans. Yummy botulism. With this substantial windfall, Kami and Sydney decide that instead of paying off the existing debt that The Beef has, they'll use the money along with another loan from Uncle Jimmy, who is most definitely in the mob, to transform The Beef into a fine dining establishment, with the goal of earning 3 Michelin stars, which, as of 2024, only 153 restaurants in the world have that honor. So yeah, no pressure. With this change, Kami and Sydney's goal becomes clear: be among the best in the culinary world. You might expect that since The Bear has illustrated how toxic the best kitchens in the world can be, that this will become a story in which these chefs learn that great things can be accomplished in a more stable environment. But Kami incorporates the toxicity learned from people like David Fields into his leadership, and despite there being some hints throughout the show that this isn't the way, it's not really leaned into enough. You see, fine dining restaurants in the real world have developed a reputation for their high-pressure, low-reward environments where anyone but the people at the top of the hierarchy have to tolerate harsh criticisms, various forms of toxicity, and some bizarre rules. The Danish restaurant Noma, run by René Redzepi, is a 3-star Michelin awarded restaurant and is considered one of the best dining establishments in the world that sells multiple course meals for as much as $500 US per person. Given Noma's prestige, you can imagine that aspiring chefs around the world would be eager for the opportunity to learn under the tutelage of one of the world's best chefs. The reality isn't so romantic though, as one ex-intern, Namrata Hedge, revealed to the New York Times that during her 3-month stint at Noma, her time was predominantly spent creating trompe-l'oeil beetles, which involve letting jam set, using stencils to carve it into the shape of a beetle, which would then be served to customers in a glass case. She would prepare 120 of these beetles every day before service, while not learning much else in the process. But to top all of this off, not only was Namrata not paid for her internship, she was forbidden from laughing. If you're an aspiring chef, getting an internship at one of the world's best restaurants should be a dream come true. It's an opportunity to gain a seemingly endless wealth of knowledge from some of the most celebrated culinary geniuses in the world, but instead, people like Namrata end up doing work which is barely any different from working on a factory production line. An internship at a world-class restaurant is a big deal though. Yes, it looks great on a resume, but fine dining is extremely complicated and varied, so being asked to do one thing hundreds of times a week when there's thousands of other things to learn makes it a practically worthless experience, and literally worthless when you consider the lack of pay. Restaurants rely heavily on the labor of interns, and before the pandemic it was reported that Noma had 34 paid cooks and around 30 interns, all unpaid. They later announced that they'll start paying their interns, but considering Rethinking recently announced that at the end of this year, Noma will be shutting down and instead focusing on global pop-up restaurants, it's too little, too late. The irony is that although Rethinking is aware of how awful it can be working in a kitchen and expresses his desire to avoid the abuse found in them, he doesn't exactly practice what he preaches. In an article published in The Lucky Peach back in 2015, Rethinking recalls how at the time he started cooking, it wasn't uncommon to see cooks getting slapped across the face for simple mistakes, plates thrown at people across the room for working too slowly, and even other chefs pulling awful pranks like leaving a pan handle over an open fire so that the next person who picked it up would scald their hand. It was bullying and abuse with the goal of teaching cooks that if you want to achieve the best results, then the possibility of suffering needs to be constantly hanging over their heads. Rethinking may not be as bad as his teachers, but if he's instructing his cooks to not laugh while not providing them with a decent variety of skills, then the spirit of those that he's learned from is still there. We as outsiders have sadly sort of accepted abusive chefs too, and even turned it into entertainment. I'm sure that many of you have seen and maybe even shared a clip or gif of Gordon Ramsay berating other chefs mercilessly on his shows. This is well known by this point, but Ramsay's behavior on his shows is heightened and choreographed for the sake of television, and if you watch any of his British produced shows, you'll see a man with a drastically toned down personality.
It's an amazing place, an amazing setting. I see someone that is hurting.
Yeah.
For what reason? Glory days, Michelin star?
Possibly.
Not look at me in the eyes! Not as pissed as I am! You f***ing are! Donkey!
Ramsay's portrayal of the megalomaniacal, perfectionist chef has helped normalize the idea that chefs who have achieved a certain level of excellence not only have the right to abuse those below them, but that enduring it will encourage them to become excellent as a result. Personally though, I don't think that anyone that makes a grilled cheese sandwich that looks like this has any right to call themselves a chef. In the menu, Julian Slowik is the egomaniac chef taken to an extreme. His staff practically see him as a god and have a cult-like level of obedience, literally placing their lives on the line for him. His status as one of the world's best chefs has led him to becoming worshipped by admirers and aspiring cooks, to the point where he has complete influence over them. It's disturbing to watch Julian and his subordinates at work, but there are parallels to real-life kitchens, where head chefs hover over the shoulders of their cooks and respond with a chorus of "Yes, chef!" whenever they're given a command. Julian's motivations and actions are mysterious, which makes it all the more unnerving. He's begun to loathe his patrons, both the ones who refuse to understand his art and the ones who revere him. The menu doesn't offer any explanation as to how Julian reached this point, which adds to the film's mystery, and it doesn't explain how his staff came to be so devoted to him that they go along with this multi-course kamikaze menu, but it speaks to the level of cult-like behavior within the kitchens ran by the world's greatest chefs. If these cooks wish to become brilliant themselves, then they must follow the orders of their god. Much like real cults, some of the world's best kitchens use similar tactics as them to indoctrinate their staff into their ways, and by this I mean emotionally breaking them down to rebuild them into the kind of person who will unquestioningly follow orders. Clinical psychologist Dr. Margaret Thaler Singer laid out the criteria and behaviors for a group or organization to be considered a cult that attempts to take control over a person's thinking and thought patterns, and every one of these correlates to what you will see in many fine dining establishments. First is to keep a person unaware of how they're being changed. In a kitchen, this means creating an environment in which a chef has little to no control over their own actions and submitting to the demands of the head chef. By going along with this, a person in turn can be rewarded by affirmations, including being told how they have potential to be great. Then there's controlling a person's social and/or physical environment, along with their time. Kitchens often require absurd work schedules, where cooks have to work weeks that can be upwards of 80 hours long. That commitment can be praised or even seen as a source of pride, but in the process they can end up becoming further detached from the reality outside of the kitchen. This leads into the next step, creating a sense of powerlessness in a person. By removing them from their family, friends, and other outsiders, they become normalized to the kitchen environment, where others celebrate unhealthy work-life balances, along with accepting varying levels of toxicity from head chefs and other colleagues. Next is what's referred to as the sacred science. Everything within the group or kitchen is considered to be the ultimate truth, which is held above all other truths found outside of the kitchen. Any beliefs or experiences to the contrary are either denied or reinterpreted to fit their environment. As the holder of the truth, the leader, i.e. the head chef, is above question or criticism. You do as they say, no questions asked. To uphold all of this, there also needs to be a system of punishments and rewards to promote learning the ideology of the group, their belief systems, and going along with the approved behaviors. When someone in the kitchen behaves well, they can be rewarded with praise or even having one of their creations put on the menu. If someone were to offer criticisms, misbehave, or even question the group, that in turn can be met with punishment. The head chef is above all else. In the context of the kitchen, they are God, and this God doesn't want to hear what their followers have to offer. They don't want to hear their thoughts on how to innovate. They just want obedience, a group of competent chefs who are willing to follow every command that comes from their mouth, because the head of the kitchen knows the secret to the universe. Just go along with what they say and only reply with, "Yes, chef." All of this is done in the name of food. The menu exemplifies all of this system to an extreme. The chefs in Julian's kitchen are without doubt a cult, and it's not too far removed from the reality of many kitchens around the world. Even though Julian and his staff are in essence a death cult, the menu highlights how it's not just the culture in the kitchen that's flawed, but the diners themselves who have transformed fine dining into what it is now, a pretentious, costly experience which is either revered too much or underappreciated. It's become something which the wealthy consume because it's expected of them, but it's lost any meaning to them as well. It's a thing tech bros do so they can brag about it to their co-workers, and something that has its success determined by aggressively picky food critics. People that are just there because the name attached to the restaurant and the prestige that comes with it. The Bear, on the other hand, seems to want to uphold these values. It treats prestige as a desirable goal and wants to cater to the kind of people we see in the menu. I understand and accept that the creators of The Bear are well within their rights to share their love of fine dining and everything that comes with it, but when it comes to the cost of it, be it financial, human, or other, In today's world where we're beginning to recognize and rightfully judge what goes into the creation of something, it seems oddly irresponsible of the show. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention how fine dining is one of many high-class industries which is led and staffed predominantly by white men. In the UK, only 10 of the 172 restaurants with a Michelin star are led by women head chefs, and of the over 250,000 professional chefs there, only 18.5% are women. This disparity translates into other groups, with the industry seriously lacking in diversity, both in the kitchen and among head chefs, an issue which is compounded when you consider the industry's tendency to dabble with culturally appropriated dishes. Chef Kwame Onwuachi tells of how he went from being a child in the Bronx who learned to cook from his mother, who ran a catering company, to running his own restaurant, which opened and shut down within 3 months, and his time working in Per Se under Chef Thomas Keller. Kwame explains how, during his time at Per Se, the racism he faced was never so transparent that he was directly called racial slurs, but it became evident from his treatment that he was treated as an outsider and discriminated against in more subtle ways. In the memoir, he says,
"I felt like I was being called the N-word with no one actually saying it. No one had to, and maybe they were smart to. So it was left to me to decide whether it was because I was black or because I was just me, that I was the only one greeted with a growling, 'Get the fuck back in the prep kitchen,' when I ran food out to the chefs in the line."
In The Bear, Chef Sydney, a black woman, is given the role of sous chef, and upon their transition into becoming a fine dining establishment, she and Kami come to the agreement that she would have an equal say in how things are run and what goes onto the menu. She's clearly extremely talented and passionate about her craft, but it eventually becomes clear that Kami doesn't want to consider any decisions made by Sydney or anyone else in the kitchen. What he says goes. Despite racial discrimination being endemic in the industry, The Bear doesn't really capitalize on the opportunity to illustrate the challenges people of color face in the kitchen. It almost feels incidental that Sydney is black and a woman, since Kami dismisses her as much as he does anyone else, with the key difference being that she's supposed to be a partner in the restaurant. Like many aspects of the show, it feels almost irresponsible. The Bear identifies the problems with fine dining, from the abuses to the unsustainability, gentrification, and even racial bias, but it never really comes close to asking why these things exist, why they're considered acceptable by so many people, and what can be done to make them better. Instead, The Bear takes every opportunity to glamorize fine dining, portraying it as a noble art which is born through suffering. It's a frustrating experience, since it knows the problems, but it doesn't want the audience to think about it too much because the food is so pretty. I know that this is my bias speaking, but I think that any product that examines an industry which exists almost entirely to cater to the wealthy and is guilty of gentrification, all while exploiting the poor and elevating the privileged, should have the responsibility to make its audience aware of its faults. The Menu may have its faults as a movie, and it's a little bit heavy-handed, but it struck a good balance. Fine dining is a genuinely impressive and special thing, but the culture surrounding it has perverted its intention to create something beautiful and new. It sucked the joy out of experimentation and making things people love from many chefs around the world who have said that they have no regrets whatsoever about leaving their jobs. In an op-ed written by ex-chef Genevieve Yam, she details how she left the industry after being diagnosed with fibromyalgia, a stress-induced pain disorder for which there is no definitive treatment. Before then, she was working 70-hour weeks, plucking herbs, dehydrating purees, simmering juices into reductions for dinners that cost $425 US per person, and for her efforts she was paid only $15 an hour. After being a once proud chef who relished the opportunity to work in a world-class kitchen, it was only upon being forced to leave by her illness that she realized that none of it was worth it, and many of her peers agree with her. In the article, Genevieve says, "As I reflect on my time in the hospitality industry, I'm relieved to watch as the most exclusive, often most exploitative fine dining restaurants finally seem to be going out of fashion. It couldn't come soon enough." The funny thing is, even with their expensive menus and months-long waits for diners to get a table there, these restaurants can't sustain themselves financially. When you take into account the cost that goes into fine dining, including the heavily populated kitchens with chefs who have to get by on terrible pay, elaborate high-end equipment, costly and hard to acquire ingredients, and the amount of food that's wasted, they're not sustainable in the slightest. It's bad enough that some chefs even say that it's impossible for an establishment to survive without free labor. Fine dining will always exist, and obviously it will have to find ways to survive since what it is right now can't continue. Regardless of how special a dish is, any amount of exploitation, discrimination, and abuse does not justify its existence, and we shouldn't convince aspiring chefs that tolerating workplace toxicity is a necessary step to becoming brilliant. After all, these prestigious chefs are still just humans, and if they're worthy of being called an arsehole, then they should work on being less of an arsehole. Food is a beautiful thing, and beauty can be found in the simple. It's why I love bread, because it's a simple idea that has had more influence on food around the world than anything that you can find in the kitchens run by the world's greatest chefs. It can be transformed into all kinds of things, and it's nourishing. It literally makes you feel good. Oh, and if you fancy learning how to make this bread yourself, I actually made a video of it on my Patreon for supporters, so check that out if you want to give it a go. Not only is it nourishing, but it can be made by anyone. Only 5 simple ingredients you can pick up at any grocery store, and after a few hours you have something that you can be proud of. Fine dining is the illusion of pride, propped up by the environments that warp the minds of young chefs to believe that a tiny ounce of validation from the masters is the most meaningful thing in the world. The world of fine dining upholds the idea that pain and suffering are integral to the creation of great art, which is something people have believed to be true for as long as we can remember. The simple fact, though, is that great art can be made without pain. In our society, we see pain as a necessary component for great art because it's marketable to those who wish to invest in it. Pain is a tool that gives something more value when it's produced by the privileged, because unlike someone working in a factory for next to no pay, these chefs have the choice to incorporate suffering as a unique selling point, and it's a disgusting, unnecessary romanticization of the artistic process. Fine dining shouldn't exist as it is, and from the looks of it, it seems as though it won't be able to continue existing for very long since it's so unsustainable. I know that the majority of you haven't sampled fine dining before, so maybe I'm wasting my breath about this, but I was rubbed the wrong way by the bear's reverence of the field and felt like talking about it. And who knows, maybe the show will prove me wrong and Kami will one day go back to making sandwiches and find its happiness. But even if you're unable to afford the fine dining experience or aren't interested in it, the next time you eat, take a moment to appreciate the beauty and joy of something simple. There's a reason why people say it's the best thing since sliced bread, because it's so damn good. Guess who's having to use a cold pack for a bit because I had a bit of an accident with the camera equipment. That'd be me. My poor fingy. I've been on YouTube for a while now as a video creator and even longer as a viewer. I go through phases when it comes to the kind of content I watch. Sometimes it's video essays, others it's reviews and retrospectives of movies and games, and when I just want some background noise while I'm working or playing, I'll put on some podcast style content, one of my favorites being the Best of the Worst series by Red Letter Media. YouTube has a huge variety of content. It's what makes it appealing since there's seemingly something for everyone. One moment you could be watching a highly produced short film, the next you could be watching a video where a 14-year-old British kid is teaching you how to fix a problem with Windows 11. Regardless of the genre of content that you see on YouTube, it's become abundantly clear that one of the most successful strategies for gaining views and an audience on the platform is to create videos that generate drama and possibly anger their viewers. That anger can then be leveraged into creating a conversation among viewers, who in turn develop some sense of community centered on the subject and compels them to explore related content with a similar tone. It also makes it easier for a creator to continually maintain engagement, where instead of visiting new subjects, they can continue talking about the same thing, since it's something that an audience wants to know about. One thing that I've noticed though when it comes to drama is that it seems people get some perverse thrill from watching it unfold. They rally around it to be a part of something, to theorize what's happening behind the scenes and explore the psychology of it. We've always had this interest though. I mean, it's why reality TV is so successful, even if most things in it are carefully choreographed by producers and editors. Let's look at the Borderlands movie as an example. Based on a video game series, it was released in theaters very recently, and after its terrible performance at the box office, it was promptly made available through streaming services. The movie was directed by Eli Roth, who was an odd choice since he's known largely for making gory horror movies, and has big names like Oscar winners Cate Blanchett, Jamie Lee Curtis, and comedians Kevin Hart and Jack Black. In the run-up to the movie's release, audiences were already skeptical of its quality and casting decisions. It had a troubled production cycle, which is often a bad sign for any movie, and in an age where movies based on video games are going through sort of a redemption arc, it reminded people of darker days where practically every adaptation was poorly received, largely because these movies were made by people who simply weren't familiar with the source material. The initial negative reception was all that was needed for people to decide that this movie will and should be a failure, that the film's fate was sealed before the first trailer was released. To be fair, it did look pretty bad. Not as bad as the Minecraft trailer though. Oof.
I am Steve.
I'm not even a fan of Minecraft, and I can tell that's not good. In the lead up to the film's release, people basically sat and waited for their expectations to be fulfilled. They'd have discussions on Reddit about why it's going to fail, what they could have done to make it better, and shared memes about why the movie they haven't seen yet is bad. The reviews came out and it was universally panned for all the reasons audiences said. Bad script, bad casting, bad direction, just bad. It's a bad movie. Shortly after the movie release, there came a deluge of YouTube videos from creators talking about how they can confirm it is indeed a bad movie. And although these creators probably don't call themselves professional critics, people treat them as such. One of the major problems with critique on YouTube, and I use that word very loosely, is that it's heavily based on finding the flaws in products, whether that's movies, games, or whatever, really. Audiences seem to have a desire to hear what's bad about something before anything else, and even if something is considered good, people often go out of their way to maintain focus on negatives. Another example being the game Concord, released recently and shut down within 11 days of its launch. It was a pretty solid game, not perfect, but because it was a multiplayer-only game that released for $40 in an overcrowded genre, it ended up being one of the worst failures in gaming history. It had only a peak player count of under 700 players after launch, which, for a game that relies on having other people to play with, is abysmal. It was also an expensive game to produce as well, with estimates being anywhere from about 100 million to 150 million, so not chump change. Once again though, people expected this game to fail from the get-go, and as the idea grew amongst gamers with people saying that it was doomed, people were less inclined to go anywhere near it. This attitude isn't the sole reason Concord failed, but I imagine it contributed to it heavily. And as I was making this video, new information came out that suggested that the game might have actually cost upwards of $400 million to produce. I don't know if this is confirmed or not, but at the same time, yikes. There was also a segment of gamers who believed that it was a get woke, go broke scenario, simply because the game contained pronouns for characters. Sorry, I mean...
Fucking pronouns!
Imagine being this angry over pronouns. Like, calm down, man. Like, you are definitely going to have a stroke if you carry on like this. YouTube in particular has an ecosystem of media criticism that only focuses on the negatives of products, and some creators even go out of their way to manufacture flaws that don't truly harm a product as a whole. One of the most famous examples is CinemaSins, a channel that's so successful even the auto-correcting Google Docs recognized that the name of the channel has no space in it. The channel started out innocently enough by spotting plot holes in movies along with things like continuity errors, but as time went by and YouTube began to favor longer videos with consistent engagement, their videos started to become a petty, smug, and often mean-spirited breakdown of each movie's supposed flaws, pointing out either extremely minor errors or things that aren't even errors at all. The creators of the channel have claimed that their videos are all in good fun and not meant to be taken seriously, but whether that's their intent or not doesn't matter because people do take it seriously. It's not uncommon to see commenters saying how they were going to watch a movie before they saw the video, but now they won't because of it, or people who actively seek the negatives in things, looking for some form of affirmation from a notable person who agrees with them. For all these commenters know, they might actually love a movie that CinemaSins tears down, but they'll never know because some guy on the internet who frequently complains that women actors aren't doing lap dances in a movie convinced them that it's not worth their time. Negativity, drama, and anger are all forms of entertainment though, and many people may not even realize that they actively seek it out. Content that has a negative tone often has a sense of importance and truth to it. It's seen as something that's almost salacious, and that by knowing it, then you'll be part of a vital conversation, even if that conversation can ultimately just be people complaining about things that don't really matter. This isn't a recent thing now, and it exists outside of the internet as well. Fox News, the most watched channel on American cable television, is practically a 24-hour daily broadcast of everything wrong with the world and the people in it, even if much of it is completely made up or overblown. They know what they're doing and who their audience is though. It's people aged 60 and above who aren't exactly what you'd call worldly, who constantly reminisce on how things used to be better when they were younger, and that all the things done to progress society have ultimately been too drastic and frayed our moral fiber. And yeah, things did used to be better if you were white and straight, but they don't see it that way since outlets like Fox News tell them that their race and orientation now makes them a victim, and that any group attempting to gain equality wants to make straight whites a victim. As we all know, a lot of people tend to lose touch with the world around them as they get older. Not everyone, but a lot of them, Americans especially. Travel is a great way to broaden your horizons and learn about different cultures, but a lot of Americans don't do that. Only 43% of Americans actually have passports, and more younger people on average want to or have traveled more than the elderly. Personally, I don't think this is too surprising though. The more education a person has, the more likely they are to want to travel, and more young people have college-level education compared to the elderly. This is just me theorizing here, but I think attitudes towards the world also play a role here too. All the generations have had it ingrained in them since birth that America is the greatest country in the world, that its faults are far and few between, and everything that it does is better than other countries. Institutions and society at large tries to instill this belief in younger people in the present as well, But because of education and more readily available information, they've become accustomed to being more critical of their country. And because of our greater connectivity with other countries, it's easier to get an insight into how governments outside of America operate. It's made them realize how things like higher education loans and private healthcare are completely broken systems, all the while they're hearing excuses from America's defenders about how it has to be this way because it's what makes them the best. People don't like having their truths challenged though, and it doesn't help when other people, news outlets, etc. try to uphold these truths, no matter how damaging they might be. Networks like Fox News, Republican politicians, and online mouthpieces affirm these ideas through the possibility of things getting even worse than they already are, that it's better to maintain the status quo, which is easier to invest in when you're someone that the status quo favors. There's been multiple occasions where I delicately tried to explain to America's defenders how other countries, including my own, do things better, and how no country should see itself as perfect, and on more than one occasion they push back by saying it's just how we do things here, as though it justifies it. I also sometimes hear, well, if you don't like it, then why don't you go back home? Why don't you apply for a passport, bitch? This is their truth though, and it's an idea that's propped up by the possibility of things being better, but that idea is sold to people through anger and fear. It makes people think that if they don't stay angry, then they make themselves vulnerable since they won't be properly prepared to react. All those people on January 6th, they were a result of this, including Jimmy Pesto. I guess Bob was right all along. He is an arsehole. That's the news for you though, a constant stream of everything bad that's happening everywhere at any given time. People like to say that they wish the news would show good things happening, but we're drawn to the negative like a moth to a flame. We want to be outraged, as much as we don't like to admit it. It doesn't help that most of the news that we consume on TV, online, and elsewhere is funded by advertisers, so there's a financial incentive to keep you looking. News anchors can tell you about a war that's happening and try to sell you prescription drugs between the segments. Social media operates on a similar model. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube use algorithms designed to keep users engaged by steering them towards outrage-inducing content. This often leads to a cycle where users continuously scroll for new posts, updates, and opinions while sharing their own thoughts. The validation they receive through likes and reposts encourages them to stay engaged, creating a dopamine-driven loop fueled by feedback from strangers. People enjoy it when others, even those that they've never met and never will, agree with them, especially when a well-known figure or influencer interacts with their posts. When something goes wrong, people want to be involved in the conversation, and that's because in a twisted way, it gives them a sense of community. They can feel affirmation from the invisible crowd that exists in online spaces. They can feel as though that what they're saying matters in important situations, and that their opinion is valuable, even though it ultimately doesn't change anything. And believe me, I'm really not trying to be cynical here, it's just what it is. If something happens like a shooting and someone makes a post with an emotional appeal to stop them from happening again, which gets thousands of engagements, it feels meaningful to the people involved, but it doesn't change anything. That's just social media for you though. It makes the things said that exist within a vacuum feel like they have an impact on the real world. So why do we go out of our way to be angry at things? We spend our entire lives pursuing happiness, and we're told that it's the most important thing to have, yet all of us can't seem to resist the allure of anger and outrage. It's one of the many strange contradictions of the human condition, but it exists for a reason. As you can probably guess, anger is a product of human evolution. It's a response in our brain, specifically our amygdala, that triggers whenever something is seen as unjust or unfavorable compared to a preferred outcome. It's a survival mechanism that helps you react to your environment, and it's the same part of you that just made you open your Discord after hearing that ping. That was me. Sorry. While they are separate emotions, anger and fear are closely related and work in tandem with each other. They both help activate our fight or flight instinct and help us react to potential dangers. And as this happens, our body releases adrenaline to assist with aggression or escaping. Adrenaline provides a boost of energy so we can react to dangers and make you feel powerful, even in a situation where you essentially have no power, such as an online discussion. As mentioned a moment ago though, social media facilitates users with the means to feel powerful by allowing them to receive engagement, which gives the opportunity for them to have their anger validated, reciprocated, and even challenged, which can create more anger and more adrenaline. Being angry, or even having your anger recognized, can also be cathartic. Even things like shouting or swearing out of anger can feel good. In fact, there's been studies that show that shouting profanities can increase a person's pain tolerance by up to 33%, since adrenaline has an analgesic effect. Simply having your anger recognized by others can be cathartic too. By being angry and seeing people react to your anger, regardless of the reaction to it, it can make you feel seen. Anger is also a response to a diminishing or absent sense of control over a situation. Control is more important to humans than we like to think. Some of us need too much of it, some of us need a smaller amount to just be comfortable, but we all need some. When we fear that we're losing control, we can respond to it by getting angry, and more commonly among men, it can be responded to with aggression, whether that's verbal or physical. I'm gonna go a bit off track here, but anger is something that's seen as a more acceptable response for men to have, since it has a close association with masculinity and a need to domineer over others, a trait related to toxic masculinity. Since we're so used to seeing men get angry, some might conclude that they're more prone to it than women, but that may not be the case. A study by Southwest Missouri State University found that women not only got as angry as men, but acted on it at the same frequency as they do. They identified that when men are forced to contain their anger, they feel less effective. Women, on the other hand, have better control over their impulses induced by anger. There's a couple of possible factors that explain this. One study showed that even though men and women have similarly sized amygdalas, women have a much larger orbital frontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that regulates aggressive impulses. The other, and perhaps more likely reason, is that in general, society conditions women to believe that it's important to keep their anger under control, and that expressions of anger are something exclusive to men. They're taught that women need to be calm and collected at all times, and it's something necessary to retain order, whilst men are permitted to sow chaos. In online spaces where people are afforded some level of anonymity and able to cultivate an identity from scratch, it's possible to express anger in a wider variety of ways compared to an in-person interaction. It could be video content, pictures, memes, comments, tweets, and so forth, but the restrictions imposed upon us by society are far looser online, which means that we're able to potentially be more aggressive, possibly to an unhealthy degree. In recent years, certain groups, especially right-wing ones, have become accustomed to complaining about cancel culture. They claim that progressive, left-wing online mobs go out of their way to find the character flaws and questionable actions of a person and bring them to light in order to ruin their reputation. It's believed that this is done because the people who are allegedly cancelled stand on the opposing end of the political spectrum, and progressives use the momentum to deplatform people that they don't like and tarnish the reputation of those they're associated with. Now, just to get this out of the way, I don't believe cancel culture is a thing. and I don't think that cancelling is really a thing. When information about a person surfaces and it causes damage to their reputation, it's more often than not the case that it's due to something that matters and has legitimacy. We should be held accountable for our actions, regardless of who we are and how long ago they happened. A lot of people like to complain about cancel culture, claiming that it's a petty sport that people online like to participate in without any regard for the damage that it does, implying that most people who get cancelled didn't actually deserve it. Some celebrities, especially ones over the age of 50, if we're being honest, even say that they live in fear of being cancelled even though they didn't do anything wrong. But personally, I can't help but think that if you're worried about being cancelled all the time, you probably did something wrong. While accountability is important, some trends have arisen when it comes to people on the internet participating during an event where someone is being called out for their actions. It usually begins with a news article, tweet, or video that's well researched and is backed up by credible witnesses or possibly victims of the perpetrator. The story gains momentum because once again, people are drawn to controversy. It gets engagement and spreads like wildfire, with thousands, possibly millions of people chiming in with their opinions. Some voice their disgust and a handful will defend them using worn-out defenses like how what they did was a long time ago or that their actions are being blown out of proportion, etc. Cancelling someone or some entity has sort of become an event. People wake up in the morning to see that it's happening again, go out of their way to inform themselves, and when armed with what they feel is enough information, they'll decide whether to join in. Some even go as far as to try and hunt down more information that hasn't been discovered yet to add fuel to the fire. This fire keeps burning until an algorithm tells you that it's no longer profitable enough for people to pay attention to and directs their eyes elsewhere. As the frequency of cancelling has increased though, it seems as though some people have developed a taste for it. Whether it affects them directly or not, people want to know what happened, gauge the level of disgust from the crowd, and decide if they should meet their level of outrage or maybe even attempt to inflate it. It's kind of a blood in the water situation. People have become drawn to it because if they join in, they can be validated by others for being angry. The collective can feel powerful since they're being recognized by the world at large, with every single voice feeling important, capable of painting the public's perception of a person or entity. It's the allure of power and control, but at the same time, I'm not saying that their rage isn't warranted. Power has its appeal, and in a world where many of us feel like we have little to no power, we sometimes take what we can get. As people have learned what goes into a successful cancellation, it's being used against people who may not actually deserve it as a means of expressing their dislike towards them. This is largely applicable to online figures such as YouTubers and influencers, where if they do something like express an opinion that some people don't agree with or are just ideologically opposed to a group, some will go out of their way to unearth information on them which some might find objectionable, or in some cases they might just fabricate evidence. And since the flow of information on the internet moves so quickly, few will go out of their way to verify whether it's true. We see and react because we don't want to miss out on something. Since I'm fairly open about where I stand politically and share many of my opinions about a variety of things, understandably, I've been met with some opposition. Because of this, I've had to deal with situations in which people have cherry-picked statements to criticize or recontextualize them in order to make them seem far worse than what was intended. On a couple of occasions, I've had people who have an issue with me completely fabricate information about me, like telling people how they've looked into my history and found something that will end my career and how they'll post it on Reddit. This isn't unique to me, but I've also had long-term supporters and people who support me on Patreon withdraw their pledges because they didn't agree with something I said in a video. Creators have access to exit surveys on Patreon where donors can state the reason why they're stopping, and on multiple occasions, I've had people say, sometimes in very cruel ways, how they're pulling their support because I've said something that they didn't entirely agree with. These have been people who've supported me since the beginning, told me how they admire me and my work, but all it took was one thing for them to change all that. Things that, in my and other people's opinions, aren't inflammatory, offensive, or without merit. Financial circumstances change, and not everyone can afford a monthly pledge to a content creator. Some people also just stop enjoying your content or don't have the time to watch it, and I do not begrudge them for that. For smaller creators such as myself, Patreon income is extremely important. Not only is it the place where I can earn more than YouTube revenue, but it's far more stable and reliable than it. Even $1 donation is worth more than 1,000 views. It's that valuable. For people to use it as a means to ensure that the content you create caters to their tastes and opinions identically, and to threaten your livelihood if you step out of line, is frankly appalling. If I'm being more frank, holding someone's income hostage is also a form of financial abuse. So if you're one of the people who use that method on me or any other creator, you should know that when you're being explicit about this behavior, you're causing psychological harm to a human being. On one occasion, and I won't mention it by name because I don't want to revisit it due to the trauma it caused, and I mean legitimate trauma, I had 20 patrons withdraw their pledge, some who had been there since I began my page, because I asked people to question their relationship with content creators. It turned out that their parasocial connection with some creators was strong enough that what I said angered them, and I lost a not insignificant amount of my monthly income, which I need to live on and pay for production costs at the same time. For a creator with thousands of patrons, that can be an acceptable loss. But for someone like me and other creators like me, who's currently surviving on below poverty wages from YouTube revenue and pledges, while being unable to work in a regular job at the same time due to PTSD, it was devastating to me. Overall, I lost a fifth of my monthly income on Patreon, all because people got mad at me and decided that it was important to punish me.
And to be clear, this wasn't just patrons, it was also commenters, tweets, DMs, Discord messages, etc. It was from everywhere.
I don't know if any of these patrons or commenters still watch my content or maybe even hate watch it, but if you do, and I hope you know who you are, I've wanted to say this for a while now. I'm not angry at you, and I try my best to understand where you were coming from. I really did. However, what you did and what some of you said has left some psychological scars on me that will probably never go away. You also hurt my wife, a bystander who didn't understand why people were so angry because she wasn't involved in this sphere. That morning, I woke up to find her crying as she read your hurtful comments, something I'll never forget and something I'll always regret, because I felt like I brought it upon her. Because of your anger, you made me feel like I was worthless. I felt bad because I couldn't be what you wanted me to be 100% of the time. And ever since then, I've truly never felt confident in my work because I fear that my career could fall apart because people like you are able to exert your power over creators in such cruel ways. I also know that there's a chance that you may feel just in your actions, regardless of what I say, and I'm not going to shame you for that, but I will ask you to contemplate why you feel just and consider why that might be problematic. I wish you the best in life, but you should know that your actions and words caused serious harm that contributed to the deterioration of my mental health and led me to revisiting the lowest point for the second time in my life. A low that was so potent, I didn't want to exist anymore. Anger has its costs, but it also has its uses too. That much is obvious, since it's something that's been passed down through human evolution for millennia. It's something that can help us survive, and when utilized properly, it can help us achieve some form of justice. Justice is an abstract concept though, one that I personally don't believe truly exists, since there's no solid consensus on what justice actually is. Anger is such a gut reaction that it can be difficult for us to not act upon it and take a moment to verify the information being presented. It doesn't help that many of us look for reasons to be angry, and in some ways, I can't blame them. The world's a bit of a mess, the economy's rigged against average people, many of us will never retire, the planet's on fire, and every single day we learn about how something else is going wrong. It's an endless shit show, and it helps when we have something concrete to direct our anger towards. It helps even more when the thing that we're angry at recognizes our anger, which is why if James Corden ever replies to my hate DMs, I can finally die happy. If you find yourself getting angry often, then I encourage you to work on identifying what makes you angry and why. Be conscious of how you behave when you're angry and do your best to control it. It's hard and it requires a lot of practice, but it's possible. Don't look for reasons to be angry, and don't just follow the crowd when they're angry, because when you do that, you make yourself susceptible to accepting misinformation as fact simply because it aligns with your current feelings. If you don't manage it, you can end up being like that guy who tried to rescue non-existent kids from a non-existent basement under a pizza restaurant. You could also try and look up some anger management courses. There's actually a lot of good information online which provides useful exercises to recognize and deal with anger. One of the most effective ones being to distance yourself from what's causing you to be angry. In other words, stay the hell away from Twitter. Although, I'm baffled as to why anyone's still on there. Like, switch to Blue Sky. It's much nicer. It's not perfect, but it's nicer. And follow me as well. I'm Salari on there. I just post pictures of my cats and the stuff that I bake. Food for the eyes. Don't eat the cats, obviously. What am I saying? Healthy discourse is a good thing, and it's great when people can have a meaningful discussion about the stuff that matters. But when you reach your twilight years and when you reminisce on your 20s and 30s, do you really want to think about all the time that you spent arguing with strangers on the internet who are never going to listen to you anyway? You have to live your life too and try to be happy because you do deserve it. We can't control how other people feel, but we can work on controlling our own feelings. It ain't easy, but it's possible. And believe me when I say, I speak from experience, because I haven't always been this chill. I've never raised my hand against anyone, but I used to have problems with anger, and it cost me a lot. I lost good friendships with people that I really cared about because I felt my anger was more important than my connection with them. And with hindsight, I can say that I was wrong. We've all done something like this, and we all regret it in some way. Without a doubt, I'm no exception. So be well, take care, try your best. Thanks for watching. You know what?
What?
They're actually here for you, not me.
I know.
My father-in-law is a wonderful man. He's an extremely talented artist, kind, considerate, and he's understanding. He's an intelligent, well-informed person who keeps up to date with what's happening in the world, and I can say for certain that he cares about everyone and wishes for no one to suffer due to who they are or their situation. He's also environmentally conscious, believes that climate change is real, and recognizes that corporations are entities that only care about profits, even if that means exploiting workers and resources. He has a single vice though: Coca-Cola. Every now and then, my father-in-law enjoys a single can of Coca-Cola, and has done so for years now. I've had numerous discussions with him about politics and how it can be hard to enjoy anything when you're aware that somewhere down the line someone has suffered for its production or procurement. The Coca-Cola company has had, to put it lightly, a spotty history. They've allegedly tortured and killed coke workers and union leaders in Colombia, polluted water resources in El Salvador, and exploited child labor. My father-in-law is aware of all this and is rightfully disgusted, but he still drinks Coca-Cola. So how can he do that, knowing that the Coca-Cola company has done and still does so many awful things and downright evil things? Well, he says that he isn't okay with it, but Coca-Cola is his one vice, and even if he were to buy from other companies, chances are they'll also have something objectionable about them. It's hard to enjoy anything that you buy from a store because most products involve some form of exploitation. He doesn't excuse the Coca-Cola company, but amidst the chaos of the world, sometimes he just wants to enjoy something that gives him comfort. And for him, it's a can of Coke. I enjoy Coca-Cola myself, especially vanilla Coke, but it gives me heartburn, so I can go without. However, the more I've learned about the world and the further I've entered adulthood, it's become increasingly apparent that it's nearly impossible for anyone to live a truly virtuous life. Even if you try your hardest, the best you can do is mitigate damage. You might decide to buy your fruits and vegetables from a local farmer's market, and that farmer may have driven that produce there in an electric vehicle that doesn't spew environment-harming carbon monoxide, but the battery in that car could be made using cobalt mined in the DRPC using child labor. In fact, it probably does, since it's so common and the world's demand for it is so high. In fact, the device that you're watching this on right now probably is the result of it, since companies like Apple use the same supply chain. As Santa Claus once said, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, and he's correct. A lot of people use this reasoning to justify having a lack of convictions though, believing that since there's no other way of doing things better, then we may as well just accept it for what it is, and those with convictions are being childish and wasting their time. I personally don't believe this, since convictions are generally a good thing to have, but what about when it comes to the media we consume? Let me tell you about two of my all-time favorite sitcoms, 30 Rock, created by Tina Fey, and Arrested Development by Mitch Hurwitz. 30 Rock and Arrested Development are both products of the 2000s and contain some of the best written comedy ever made with an impeccable main cast. 30 Rock lasted for 7 seasons and I would argue didn't have a single bad episode. I would even go as far as to say that the show only got better as it went along, which is rare for a sitcom. Arrested Development had 2 perfect seasons, one great one, and a couple of duds once Netflix bought the rights to it, but those first 3 seasons were so great that to this day it's still considered peak comedy. Despite showing their age, both of these shows have held up extremely well. There's a few bits of dated referential humor in them, but it's nevertheless still effective. I do and always will think that 30 Rock and Arrested Development are brilliant, but that doesn't mean that I believe they're perfect, and I wouldn't be the first to say that. While these products are worthy of praise, they've also aged poorly in numerous ways, but to be more specific, they're products of their era. Arrested Development was first aired back in 2003 when audience sensibilities were different, and the kind of jokes writers could get away with included certain jokes that they couldn't do now. Arrested Development may have been a very funny and witty show, but it wasn't above making jokes at the expense of others, specifically vulnerable groups. The show most commonly made gay jokes involving the character Tobias Funke. While Tobias was a very funny character and seen as the butt of every joke, as the show went on it seemed to lean more and more into the idea of him being a repressed gay man. The crux of every joke was, isn't it funny that Tobias did or said something that's considered gay? During this era, jokes at the expense of LGBTQ+ people were the norm, whether that was in movies or TV shows. Writers and audiences felt that queerness or transness is a source of comedy because it's different and unfamiliar to them. And when something is unfamiliar or even seen as weird, it can be treated as a valid target for derision by those who don't understand why that's a problem. Arrested Development also made jokes at the expense of trans people, homeless people, people of color, and its third season went heavy on ableist humor with the character Rita, played by Charlize Theron, who is at first believed to be a quirky British woman, is eventually revealed to be someone with intellectual disabilities. To communicate this to others, she wears a bracelet that the other characters at first believe says Mr. F, but they later find out that it means mentally blank female. To say the show hasn't aged well is a bit of an understatement, really. These jokes don't define the series as a whole, but it's definitely a case of a show that got away with things then that it couldn't do now. Would it suffer without these jokes? I don't believe so personally, since it's held up by a lot of great and easier to stomach jokes, but I guess you have to question whether it's okay to enjoy the whole product given its glaring flaws. 30 Rock has a similar problem. While it is hilariously written, it suffers from the same faults of its era. One of the show's most poorly aged elements is its character Paul, who cross-dresses as one of the other characters, Jenna Maroney. The fact that Paul is a cross-dresser isn't the problem, it's the fact that he, and I'm using the pronoun he because that's how they address him, is used as a vehicle for transphobic humor. There's a variety of offensive pronoun usages, like Paul being referred to as a schman, references to his anatomy, and it leans into the appalling stereotype of trans people being treated as sexual deviants, since he and Jenna engage in a variety of obscene acts. 30 Rock, along with some other shows, has had a handful of episodes removed from streaming services too. Back in 2020, during the Black Lives Matter protests, which gained worldwide attention, companies and corporations were put in a position where they couldn't remain silent on such an important issue anymore, and they felt they had to accept responsibility for potentially contributing to discrimination. As a response to this, streaming services like Hulu, Netflix, Max, and others deleted existing episodes that contained racially insensitive content, which typically meant characters dressed up in blackface or some other variation. 30 Rock had 4 episodes removed, each of which contained some form of blackface, and other shows including Scrubs, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, The Office, and Community did too. Community was an interesting case though, since it was an episode in which the group played Dungeons & Dragons, and Ken Jeong painted his face to look like a dark elf, a race in the game with black skin. But to this day, you can still watch the Season 3 episode, The First Chang Dynasty, in which Pierce, played by Chevy Chase, dresses up as an Indian Swami, complete with brownface. Yvette Nicole Brown, who played Shirley in Community and a black woman, even went so far as to say that she felt that the removal was an overcorrection and that most people would be able to understand the distinction. I guess the question is, should all of these episodes have been removed? Does it make a difference in the world whether they're seen by fresh eyes or revisited by people who've already seen them? Well, if there's one thing that we all know by now, it's that many companies like to portray themselves as caring and empathetic towards society. It's the same reason why so many ads about social issues went viral, probably the most famous being Gillette's ad about toxic masculinity, and the most infamous being the Pepsi ad with Kendall Jenner, which was swiftly taken off the air because of how horribly embarrassing it was. On one hand, yes, these portrayals are universally inappropriate and offensive. It's easy to excuse them by saying that it was a different time and comedic sensibilities were edgier back then, but that doesn't make it okay. It was insensitive then and it's insensitive now. We as a society have just become more vocal about racist humor being wrong. Removing the episodes feels more like a band-aid than anything else. It's an entity saying that it's not right to allow such offensive things to exist, but art is in many ways a time capsule. It's something that can represent a specific moment and give us an insight on what people were like during different eras. Erasing the objectionable parts of art makes the whole of it feel less honest and sometimes incomplete. Can these offensive episodes still cause harm? Potentially, yes, since there are people who go out of their way to watch it and find hilarity in jokes at the expense of minorities and vulnerable people. You could even go as far as to say that it causes harm by financially contributing to the companies that distribute the content, thus communicating that it's something that people want more of. After all, for a business, profits come ahead of all else. Given how our sensibilities have changed though, and how younger generations such as Gen Zs and Millennials are able to quickly recognize problematic content, there's an argument to be made that these episodes could have been left in place and audiences would be able to apply their own knowledge, allowing them to recognize not only whether something is problematic, but whether they should dismiss the entire product as a result. None of us are perfect, apart from me, of course. And art has to be created by one or more people, and those people have their own views of the world, which inevitably makes its way into the art that they produce. In literary theory, there's the idea of the death of the author, which means that once a text is in the hands of the audience, what that text ultimately means is the responsibility of them and not the creator of them. This theory was introduced by French philosopher Roland Barthes in 1967, but thanks to technology, the world is a very different place compared to back then. Before the internet, the amount of information a person had on an artist was extremely limited compared to now. They might have had some TV or print interviews, but that was just a slither of their personality and beliefs. Thanks to social media, for better or worse, creators get to share their thoughts and beliefs as much as they want on sites like Twitter 24 hours a day, and some of them can really take advantage of that. They can interact with their audience, get feedback for future creations, and share their opinions on basically anything. This is sadly where I have to talk about the author of the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling. I'm not happy about it too. Believe me. For many years, the fans of the Harry Potter series enjoyed being able to interact with the author, who has undoubtedly had a great deal of influence on people's lives and childhoods. JK shared her insights and inspirations that went into the creation of the series and provided additional details about characters that were left out of the book. Although sometimes it was kind of bollocks, to be honest with you. Like the time that she said she never said Hermione was white, even though she explicitly did. In recent years, though, Rowling has become insistent on ruining any goodwill that she's gained from her fans over the years by sharing her blatantly transphobic opinions and has refused to accept any criticism for it, regardless of how valid it may be. She's also aligned herself with figures and groups that have similar sentiments. I don't think it's too surprising though, given that not only is Rowling a British person that's past the age of 45, which is like the main transphobe demographic for some reason, Rowling is also immensely wealthy, influential, and beloved by millions of people across the world since she created a series of books that meant so much to them. People with wealth and influence are naturally inclined to reject criticism. It's hard for us average people to understand, but when a person is in a position in which the world has rewarded you so handsomely for being you, the concept of being challenged becomes a foreign idea to them. They've spent years being told that they've done so much good, so it's easy for them to believe that their opinions and beliefs hold more value than a stranger on the internet, regardless of the validity of that stranger's statement. For a lot of Harry Potter fans, this put them in a difficult position. Millions of people who grew up reading Harry Potter books, watching the movies, and playing the video games, they literally helped form people into who they are. But now, for those who disagreed with Rowling, of which there were many, they found themselves in a difficult position. They had to ask themselves, can I truly enjoy this series knowing what the author believes in? And some even felt bad about the fact that this series held such a special place in their hearts, while knowing it was made by a person who denies people of their identity. When the game Hogwarts Legacy was released, many fans of the series were put in a difficult position. This was a high-profile release that received a ton of critical acclaim, so for those who loved the series, it had a tremendous amount of appeal. For those who opposed Rowling's point of view, though, it became a difficult choice. Do you stick with your convictions and not play it? Play it while holding on to your convictions but potentially be judged by others, or abandon your convictions for the sake of enjoying something? The game came out and it was a massive commercial success, becoming the highest selling game of the year, so evidently any kind of boycotting that was in place didn't leave a significant dent. Then there were people who justified buying the game with limp, overused arguments, essentially implying that people who have convictions are losers. They said things like, if you're boycotting the game, then why aren't you boycotting bookstores and Universal Studios? If you really cared, then you'd be doing all that. It's the equivalent of people saying, if you're against climate change, then why do you have a car? So, in a situation like this, can you simply detach the author from the product? I suppose if you want to mitigate harm, then the answer is to simply not support the author, but I think there's an argument to be made for letting people enjoy something even if it's tinged with guilt. I'll get to that though. If we're being real though, the Harry Potter series has had plenty of objectionable stuff. The greedy goblin bankers with hooked noses, werewolves who mirror gay panic stereotypes, the name of non-white characters like Cho Chang. I mean, really? Cho Chang? What would you call the Muslim character, Joanne? Ramadan Patel? Personally, I've never been a fan of Harry Potter though. Dragon Ball Z is way better. There are inverses of this scenario though, where the works of the author have aged poorly, but their views have evolved. One prime example is It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia by Rob McElhenney and Glenn Howerton. Sunny was first aired back in 2005 and is still going to this day, making it the longest running live-action American sitcom of all time. In its early days, Sunny was a prime example of mid-2000s edgy humor. It used what's often referred to as meta-bigotry, which is a style of humor where jokes that were racist, sexist, homophobic, etc. were considered acceptable on the grounds of the audience not taking them as fact. It sounds kind of weird saying it out loud, but the gist of it is that I know this is a bad thing, but it's funny because it's shocking. So a person could believe that something like a racial stereotype isn't true, but feel that it's okay to laugh at a racist joke because of that. It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia's earlier seasons were filled to the brim with edgy, offensive jokes at the expense of marginalized groups, with one episode title even containing an ableist slur. There were times where characters pretended to have intellectual disabilities, wore blackface, were homophobic, and one of its most egregious inclusions was the treatment of the character Carmen. The character Mac is revealed to be dating Carmen, who is a trans woman. The gang doesn't refer to her as Carmen though. Instead, she gets called by a well-known transphobic slur, which I absolutely won't be repeating. Jokes were made about her anatomy. Mac was ridiculed for being physically intimate with Carmen, largely because she hadn't received bottom surgery. Him dating Carmen led the gang to suspect that Mac is gay, and on occasions they asked her directly about her transition in offensive ways. A lot of comedies from the 2000s have aged very poorly, but in many respects, Sunny has aged like milk left in a hot car, and the treatment of Carmen is just one of the many reasons. However, the creators of the show have since grown as people and admitted that their treatment of Carmen was wrong. In an interview with Showbiz Cheat Sheet, Rob McElhenney said, Carmen, who's transgender on the show, but we called her something else, we referred to her in a derogatory term, which at the time we didn't recognize was derogatory, and that's our fault and ignorance, because we didn't do our homework and reach out to the community to find out. We just assumed that it was appropriate to call this person this derogatory term. Then in subsequent years, we realized no, it was hurtful and it was cruel. We can't retroactively go back and change what we've done, but what we can do is when we introduce her again in subsequent episodes, we can change the vernacular. It's not easy recognizing or admitting to your ignorance, and a lot of people choose to take new information as direct criticism of their character. It's the same reason why when people are told that they're doing something racist, they'll deflect it by saying something like, "I can't be racist, I have a black friend." Knowing that the creators of Sunny have changed their points of view over the years and learned why some of the jokes they've made throughout the series are actually derogatory, those episodes still exist and they're not easier to stomach. A lot of writers, especially in the field of comedy, haven't been so accepting though. Many stand-up comedians who were popular around the 90s and 2000s regularly lament how PC culture has stifled comedy to the point where it's difficult to write a joke without offending people. These comedians are generally known for their edgy humor, some adopting that form of meta-bigotry with jokes based around gender, sexual orientation, race, ability, and so on. But to say that it's too hard to write an inoffensive joke is just a poor excuse. Audience sensibilities change over the years, not just in respect to what's considered tasteless, and the job of a comedian is to change with the times. Comedians can't blame the audience for not laughing because it's not the audience's responsibility to laugh. If they don't laugh, then that's the fault of the comedian. But some of these comics have developed such a large ego that they simply can't accept that they're the problem. It's like if a chef served expired food to a diner and they complain, and the chef responds to it by saying, "Your palate isn't refined enough to enjoy it." Comedy evolves, and comedians have to evolve with it. Frankie Boyle used to have one of the most offensive, edgiest acts out there, but he's since changed, retaining his shock humor but not punching down. Same with Patton Oswalt. He's been going since the 90s and he's still great without resorting to targeting vulnerable people. Offensive and shocking comedy can exist in its own space though, and it lives on through satire. One notable example being HBO's Veep, created by British comedy legend Armando Iannucci. Veep revolves around Selina Meyer, the Vice President of the US, and her staff. It's about her ambitions and failures, and it genuinely is a brilliant look at how American politics are a corrupt mess. But most of all, it illustrates how the country is led by self-serving, privileged people who don't care about the needs of the public. These are some of the worst people in the world, and unsurprisingly, they say some pretty offensive things. The show is explicit about how you shouldn't be on their side or even sympathize with them despite their flaws, since they have no moral compass to speak of. When a crass joke is delivered, it serves to show you how terrible they are, but the humor comes from being disgusted and witnessing their failures. It's edgy, but it exists with a purpose. When it comes to older sitcoms, you'll often hear the refrain, "You couldn't get away with that these days," and one popular example is the US version of The Office, given that it contains a variety of jokes that contain outdated verbiage or sentiments. However, the show is still popular, and, personally, I would argue that it would be possible to make it, because it was never intended to be offensive. The majority of poor taste content in The Office is delivered by Michael Scott, who's portrayed as an out-of-touch person, and the cast never responds positively to his offensive humor. The writers never intended for us to laugh with Michael Scott, and that should be obvious to anyone that watches the show. It's funny watching this man ostracize himself by being so insensitive and oblivious to his faults, but by no means is he supposed to be agreed with. Offensive comedy is still possible, it just has to be done right. There are audiences who do miss edgy humor though, and like to believe that if something is a joke, then it can't be criticized regardless of how harmful it is, but that's not acceptable. Jokes still contain a nugget of truth, and there are people who do take them seriously. Right-wing people in particular have taken to protesting censorship in comedy, among many other things, claiming that comedians should be allowed to joke about anything and that by restricting them, then comedy can't reach its full potential. In response to this, some right-wing comedians and media producers have taken to creating their own content separate from the mainstream, with a heavy emphasis on politically incorrect humor. The initiative to create counterculture comedy hasn't been very successful though, and isn't anywhere close to entering the mainstream. Not only have the creators chosen to ignore being politically correct, they've leaned into being as offensive as possible and being transparently cruel towards certain groups. One example was the movie Lady Ballers, written, directed, and starring Daily Wire CEO Jeremy Boring, who I'm sure lives up to his last name very well. It's a story about a group of cis men who enter the world of women's sport while claiming to be trans women. They end up defeating all of their women opponents in an attempt to illustrate the ludicrous idea that men have a natural advantage over women in sport and that there's a possibility that people will fake their gender to win. It's a crass, offensive, and uninformed critique on a subject that the writers were clearly willingly ignorant about, and to top it all off, it's not even funny. Unless you believe that a man dressing up as a woman by wearing a cheap wig while making goofy faces is the height of comedy. Right-wingers just aren't very good at comedy in general, and that's largely because it's fueled by vitriol towards people who stand out from the rest of the world, who in their eyes aren't considered normal, and that their refusal to adapt to what the world expects from them is something that should make them a target. But some people loved it, and I'm sure you can imagine who those people are and why they would find something like Lady Ballers funny. And look, I know that humor is subjective. If you watched the movie and found it hilarious and you just think that I don't like it because I don't agree with you ideologically, you would be wrong. Even if you do desire comedy that openly mocks vulnerable people, which I don't think you should, obviously, I'm sure you could do better than this trash. People change, and the times change. What could have been considered acceptable back in the 2000s might be unthinkable now, and the people who create the media that we love are humans with all sorts of faults. Just like us though, they can change or stay stuck in their ways. Whether you enjoy something or not, I think depends on how you enjoy it. When I think back on the time when I was much younger and originally watched and enjoyed shows like Arrested Development and 30 Rock, there were probably some jokes that I laughed at and really should have known better, but the sensibilities of those eras taught me that it was okay to laugh, even when it's a joke at the expense of someone who didn't deserve it. Now, when I rewatch these shows or anything that I haven't seen before with similar content, I don't find it funny. I find it cringy or downright appalling. They haven't aged well, and time has proven them to be wrong in their choices. In a way, though, it makes me think of the person I've become. I'm more tolerant than I used to be, more compassionate towards people, and understand that vulnerable people are especially deserving of compassion and support. They don't deserve to be mocked because of who they are, because some writer wants to offend or get a very cheap laugh. Because any comedian worth their salt will tell you, comedy requires effort. And if you're not willing to put in the effort, then you should probably leave the joke writing to someone else, someone who's better at it. Reckoning with a problematic author can be tricky though. As I mentioned earlier, if something is meaningful to you but you're opposed to the author's beliefs, then it can make your relationship with their creations tricky. How you wish to navigate that is really up to you, but I don't think we should always criticize someone if they want to enjoy something special to them, if they want to enjoy an occasional can of Coke. I think it's a problem when people develop ham-fisted arguments in favor of enjoying the works of problematic creators though, since it's ultimately self-serving and diminishes the value of having convictions. And, if I'm being real with you, if you really want to enjoy something without giving money to the creator or the company that produces it, then piracy is an option. Don't want to buy something from a AAA video game company that just laid off hundreds of its employees while announcing record profits to their shareholders? Then don't. Find it online, fire up BitTorrent and a reliable VPN, and before you know it, you've got yourself a guilt-free video game. The internet's got it all: movies, TV shows, music, you name it. You just have to know where to look. I've just been informed by my fictional lawyer that I should state that my previous statement was made for the purposes of comedy and was in no way an endorsement to illegally download anything. I also do not claim any responsibility for any legal action that is taken on you should you be caught pirating by the local authorities. So, as with everything, consume in moderation and with consideration of where something has come from and who made it. If you can enjoy something but also recognize its faults and why it has those faults, I believe that's ultimately a good thing, and you should take some pride in being so mindful. If, on the other hand, you prefer to avoid something entirely because of its faults, no matter how large or small, then that's your prerogative too. What matters is that we do better moving forward and try to evolve, and I think that media producers are, in general, doing a much better job than what they were doing 20 years ago, and that's because we, as an audience, have spoken and said that we don't want something that can be harmful towards others, even if it's sold to us under the guise of being entertainment or comedy. But I'd be happy to hear what you think about this tricky to navigate subject, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Be nice to each other, be well, and I'll see you next time.